Welcome, and thank you for standing by. During today's conference, all lines will be in listen-only mode. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, please disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the conference over to Tommy Wright. Thank you. You may begin.
Tommy Wright. Please note that I mentioned my name before speaking, and we will be asking all presenters to do the same. Good morning, and welcome to the 2021 Spring Virtual Meeting of the Census Bureau Scientific Advisory Committee, sometimes referred to as CSAC. Committee members, we are happy to have you join us, and we look forward to a productive discussion over the next 2 days. As I mentioned, I am Tommy Wright, the designated federal official for the Census Scientific Advisory Committee. In this role, I am required to preside over the advisory committee meeting specified by the Federal Advisory Committee Act, also known as FACA. Most of the time at the Census Bureau, I am honored to serve as chief of the Center for Statistical Research and Methodology. The proceedings of this meeting are being displayed at the web link found on the committee's website, and the number for the audio is also displayed on the committee meeting page. Information for closed captioning services is also listed on the website. Both the link and the conference line can also be found on the Federal Register notice. During this 2-day meeting, only committee members are permitted to ask questions and are to make comments of Census Bureau presenters. Committee members, we ask that you keep your lines muted during this call unless you are called upon to speak. To help facilitate discussion, members' lines will be kept open to allow more efficient discussion, so we must keep background noise to a minimum. Please note, personal video will not be available during this meeting. Committee members, if you would like to comment, please click the raise hand icon found on the lower right-hand corner. Allison Plyer, the committee chair, will see your virtual hand raised and will call on you in turn. Because this meeting is being recorded for transcripts, we ask that you clearly state your name each time before speaking for the record. Allison will also be responsible for facilitating and leading the committee discussions during the meeting. The public will have an opportunity to comment on tomorrow at 1:55 p.m. during the public comment period. During that time, we will welcome members from the public to provide their comments using the chat feature. I, as the designated federal officer, will read the public comments during that period. The Federal Register notice, located on the committee's website, provides more information on submitting written comments. All meeting materials and written public comments are posted on the committee website for public viewing. At this time, we would like to thank all members of the public, Census Bureau leadership, Department of Commerce staff, congressional staff, and regional staff members who are observing today's proceedings. Before proceeding with the agenda for today, I would like to share part of an email from legal staff, Miles Ryan, who has joined us in the past, attorney advisor with the Office of the General Counsel, U.S. Department of Commerce. His brief email reads, "Friends, regarding the CSAC meetings today and Friday, March 18th and 19th, please have an announcement made at the beginning of the census, at the beginning that the Census Bureau and Census Bureau officials will not be commenting on any litigation or responding to any questions related to litigation. Census Bureau officials should also be advised not to respond to any legal analysis questions, specifically regarding differential privacy if it comes up. Census Bureau officials should not respond and or engage in any discussion that touches upon how differential privacy complies with the Constitution or statute. Thanks." It is my understanding also that the Census Bureau staff may and will answer substantive questions about differential privacy and other topics. But Census Bureau staff will stay away from questions on the litigation and anything that calls for a legal analysis or conclusion. Now for an overview of today's agenda. By the way, I should add that the agenda is very full, as you may note, over the next 2 days, and I will be reminding people, committee members, and particularly I will be reminding Census Bureau presenters, my colleagues, to stay on time and to be aware of the schedule constantly. Our meeting agenda reflects a broad range of topics. As always, we develop the agenda in response to the Census Bureau's need to share and introduce research and program developments requiring your attention. The agenda also includes topics the committee recommended on critical program areas and research. Each topic session will be broken into 3 parts. There will be a presentation by Census Bureau staff, there will be a committee discussion presentation, and then the full committee will have a discussion. I will introduce Census Bureau presenters, and Allison will introduce and present the discussion for the committee, as well as oversee the committee discussion. First on today's agenda, our committee chair, Allison Plyer, will share remarks and introduce committee members. Following Allison, Ron Jarman will provide executive remarks, followed by committee discussion. Al Fontenot and Deb Stemkowski will present the 2020 Census Operational Review, followed by discussant Juan Pablo Horcad and committee discussion. Michael Thiem and Barbara Lepresky will present the Post-Enumeration Data Processing Status, followed by discussant Jay Bright and committee discussion. We will pause for a 10-minute break at about 1 p.m. Tim Kennel and Pat Cantwell will present the Post-Enumeration Survey update, followed by discussant John Chaika and committee discussion. Christine Hartley and Eric Jensen will present the Population Estimates Program, followed by discussant Rochelle Winkler, and that will include a committee discussion. Sally Keller and Dan Mirren of the Jason Study Group will present the assessment of 2020 census data quality processes, followed by discussant Kunal Talwar and committee discussion. We'll stop briefly for a 10-minute break at about 3:05. At that time, we will end today's proceedings. The committee members will congregate amongst themselves to discuss and formulate recommendations. Allison Plyer, the committee chair, will lead the committee discussion and formulation of recommendations. We will reconvene tomorrow morning for day 2 of the CSAC meeting. I would like to remind committee members to please click the raise hand icon when you're ready to speak. Once called upon by the chair, clearly state your name for the record. This is needed each and every time you speak. As a reminder to the public, during the question and answer sessions occurring today, only committee members are permitted to ask questions or make comments. And now, Allison Plyer, I will turn it over to her, who will bring chair's remarks and introduce committee members. Allison?
Thank you, Tommy. This is Allison Plyer, CSAC chair. Good morning and welcome to the spring 2021 CSAC meeting. As a reminder, the purpose of the Census Scientific Advisory Committee is to provide scientific and technical expertise to address Census Bureau objectives and programs. Well, it's been a heck of a year. I was recalling this time last year, maybe y'all remember too, I was in my office seeing projections of virus data just a couple weeks before this exact date, hearing, that several companies and institutions were starting to ground CSAC members from traveling. And then Ron Jarman called to say the spring 2020 meeting just had to be canceled. And within a few days, all the census staff were suddenly moved to working from home. Yeah, it's been quite a year. I want to start by thanking the Census Advisory Committee staff. There's no doubt that managing these meetings remotely is exponentially more work than doing so in person. And several of the staff were brand new in their positions when the pandemic hit, and they've done an amazing job. And moreover, the entire 2020 census was surely exponentially more work than had been anticipated. Between the pandemics and the natural disasters and the shifting timelines and the lawsuits, it's really been a heck of a year. But the Bureau's career staff really rose to the occasion. And most important of all, they've put science and the integrity and quality of the data above all else. And for your hard work, your dedication, and your commitment to producing the highest quality data, we want to thank you. So CSAC members, I hope you can unmute your phones for a second and join me in giving a big round of applause for the amazing Census Bureau staff. Please, let's cheer. Thank you. Really, Census, you guys are amazing, and I wish we could be there to express our gratitude in some larger way, and just you could see the look on our faces. Really, the work you've done has been incredible. So, well, let's go around and have the CSAC members introduce ourselves. I'll ask you to say 4 things about yourself: your name, your organization, a sentence about your work or your research, and then where you're calling in from. So I'll go first and then call on you one at a time. I'm Allison Plyer, Chief Demographer of the Data Center in New Orleans. My expertise is in informing disaster recovery by communicating key post-disaster demographic and economic trends that inform policy and private investment decisions. I'm calling in from New Orleans, where we just had another major winter storm last night. I hear there were tornadoes in Mississippi, so I'm hoping Jeff Lauer is okay. We'll hear from him in a second. But why don't we start with Andrew Samwick.
Hi, this is Andrew Samwick. I'm a professor of economics at Dartmouth College. I'm calling in from just across the river in Norwich, Vermont, and I do research on public economics and finance, currently with some projects on higher education finance. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Deborah Bach.
Hi, I'm Deborah Balk. I am the director of the CUNY Institute for Demographic Research at the City University of New York and professor of public affairs at the Mark School at Baruch College. And I do work on urbanization and climate change using census data with satellite information and so forth. And that's some of the skill set I bring to this advisory committee. Nice to be here today.
Thanks, Deborah. Jay Bright.
Good morning, this is Jay Bright. I'm a professor of statistics at Colorado State University. I'm a statistician with interests in survey methodology, and I'm calling in from Fort Collins, Colorado.
Great, thank you, Jay. Jeff Lauer. You've got to take yourself off mute, Jeff, if you're talking. We don't hear you, Jeff. I hope the tornadoes didn't get you, but I can see you're signed in. So I'll come back to you. Let's go to Jessica McKellar.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica McKellar. I am a founder and CTO of a company that provides financial services to small businesses, and I'm in San Francisco.
Excellent, thanks. Joe Whitley, are you here? I don't see Joe signed into the WebEx, so I'm not sure if he's here or not, or if he called in. If you might be on mute, Joe. Okay, we'll come back to Joe. How about John Chaika?
Good morning. This is John Chaika. I'm recently retired from consulting, and my work has included administrative records, survey research, and income data, and I'm calling in from Bethesda, Maryland.
Thank you, John. Juan Pablo Arcade.
Good morning. This is Juan Pablo Arcade. I'm a professor in computer science at the University of Iowa. My area of research is human-computer interaction, and this morning I'm calling from cloudy and chilly Iowa City.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. Now, Cassie Pettit, I think she might not be signed in yet. I know she was joining us a little late. Okay. So I'll come back to her in a second. Krishna Rao.
Hi, Jim. This is Krishna. Krishna Rao. I am Vice President of Analytics for Zillow Group, a real estate marketplace and platform, calling in from Seattle. Excited for the next couple of days.
Thank you. Okay, Kristen Moore. And Kristen, if you're talking, we don't hear you. You might be on mute. I know you're signed into WebEx, but we're not hearing you. Okay, well, we'll come back. Kunal Talwar.
Hi, good morning. I'm Kunal Talwar. I'm at Apple. I'm a research scientist at Apple, and I work in privacy, machine learning, and algorithms, and I'm calling in from the Bay Area in California.
Great, thank you. Mario Marazzi.
Hi, everyone. This is Mario Marazzi. I'm calling in from sunny San Juan, Puerto Rico. Formerly, I was the executive director of the Puerto Rico Institute of Statistics. I'm an economist. I'm interested in all things official statistical methodology, and I'm happy to be here. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks, Mario. Rochelle Winkler.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rochelle Winkler. I am a professor of sociology and demography at Michigan Technological University, and my expertise is in rural demography, also spatial demography and applied demography, especially small area estimates and projections. And I'm calling today from Houghton, Michigan, in the western Upper Peninsula near the shores of Lake Superior.
Excellent. Wow. Thanks, Michelle. Tom Brunel.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Tom Brunel, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of Texas at Dallas. And my intellectual interests are in representation. So I study American elections and redistricting. And I'm calling in from the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Great. Welcome, Tom. You all may know that Tom Brunel once considered the job of the director of Census Bureau, but I think Tom chose wisely because being a member of CSAC will be a much lighter lift. We're glad to have you. And then Bill Clark.
Yes, hi, everyone. It's Bill Clark calling in from State College, PA, where I am Associate Dean of the Graduate School at Penn State. Substantively, I'm a political scientist that focused on comparative political institutions. I'm happy to be a new member of the CSAC.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Glad to have you. A special welcome to both Bill and Tom, our new members. Let's see. Circling back, Jeff Lauer, can you hear us?
Hi, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, this is Jeff Lauer, and yeah, the tornadoes passed us without incident, so everything's good here in Huntsville, Alabama. I work for a company called NV5 Quantum Geospatial, and my background is in remote sensing and geospatial surveying.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And let me see if Joe Whitley is with us. Joe, are you there? Doesn't sound like it. Okay, and I know Kathy Pettit was going to be late, so we'll just let her join us when she's able to, and she can introduce herself then. Unfortunately, Lou Fisher will not be able to join us due to some family issues, and Lou, we're sending you our best wishes and prayers. So thank you to everyone on CSAC for being here today. I really can't overstate how important your contributions of time and expertise are to the Census Bureau. Thank you for your service to our country. Because we aren't meeting in person, I reached out to speak one-on-one with each CSAC member to hear any particular issues they're most concerned about. And while we might not address all of these today, I wanted to just take a moment to share with the Bureau some of the topics on CSAC's mind. So we're interested to know how the Internet self-response interface for the 2020 census worked. Was it usable? For whom? What were the glitches? Obviously, it was really successful, and we are interested to know what additional learnings there are for future. We're wondering if there were more non-ID responses than you expected and what challenges that might have created. We wanted to know about the question resolution process and whether localities will be able to supply additional data to address any undercounts in the 2020 census results. I think we're going to be having a one-way briefing on that sometime after the meeting, so we're looking forward to that. There's concern about the brand of the Census Bureau and how it may have been impacted by the events of the last year. we're also wondering what kind of guardrails could be put in place in the future. So, for example, we wonder if it would be possible to codify scientific processes that are crucial and can't be cut short in the future. There's also, of course, still concern about differential privacy and its effects on the accuracy and usability of the 2020 data. Obviously, that's work underway, but with all the private data that's out there, the 2020 census data would seem to have really pretty little value to hackers. So we're hoping that the strong efforts to protect the data won't be so severe that it renders the data unusable. There's a lot of interest in thinking ahead to 2030. Will it be a person-based rather than household-based census? Will there be greater use of administrative records? And could we do an in-depth look at other countries' census innovations to draw some lessons for future? There's also concern that with 6 CSAC members rolling off the committee after this meeting, that members will be added who are data users outside of academia. Given, the most impactful use cases for census data have to do with business decisions and community planning decisions, non-academic CSAC members are particularly important. There's also a significant concern that the presentations today do not exceed their allotted time. The CSAC discussants have all committed to limiting their remarks to 5 minutes, and we want the census presenters to do whatever it takes to make sure they don't exceed their allotted time. I know a lot of them aren't even on the phone yet, but we have a really packed agenda, so we'll try to make that point once they get on as well. And finally, the CSAC members have affirmed that we will make recommendations based on science. We will not engage in political or legal conversations, and that's what you can expect of us. It's worth mentioning that I am one of the 6 members rolling off the committee, so this will be my last meeting. And I'm excited about the broad range of topics we'll be covering, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Tommy.
Thank you very much, Allison. And I'm going to turn it over to Ron Jarman, who is the Acting Director of the U.S. Bureau of the Census, for executive comments. Ron?
Good morning. Thank you, Tommy, and hello, everyone. And I guess I'm supposed to say where I'm calling in from. I'm calling in from my basement office in Alexandria, Virginia, so which has seen lots of interesting things happen over the past year, like Allison said. So just the point that Allison just made with 6 members' terms expiring, including her own. In addition to Allison, last meeting, this is also the last meeting for Andrew Samwick, Juan Pablo, Jeff, and thank goodness you escaped the tornadoes last night. Kathy Pettit, who's not on yet, and Krishna Rao out in Seattle. So first of all, I just want to thank Allison for all the great work that you've done, especially as chair. To stay on time, I won't make everybody unmute and applaud, but know that everyone's applauding in the background. But to everyone else who's moving off the committee, our deepest and most sincere thanks to all the hard work that you've done. And I know that this is on top of all the other stuff you have to do in your normal day job and with your families and everything. And it's a great testament to your dedication to the work of the Census Bureau and to the American citizens that you've taken your time out of your busy life to be part of us. And so thanks a lot. But also I want to welcome our 2 new committee members who introduced themselves just a few minutes ago. So Bill Clark from Penn State and Tom Brunell from University of Texas, Dallas. Really appreciate you both stepping up to this role and look forward to working with you. But we will be working over the coming months to make sure that we fill the vacancies. And Allison, really, the advice you provided is spot on, and we'll be looking to make sure that we have folks that represent our entire data user community. So, again, thanks to everybody for your service up till now and your service into the future for those of you that are sticking around. So, let me just kind of give a few updates. So, like Allison said, the COVID-19 pandemic was a big challenge to Census Bureau operations, and so we obviously monitored the changing conditions at the state and local level, working with lots of officials at various levels and in various walks of life, from public health officials to local partners and even public safety folks. And as things moved along, we had to pause our field work and then go with a phased restart to our various 2020 census operations, so that we could ensure that we did get a complete and accurate 2020 census. So just to kind of recap how things went. First of all, I think importantly, about two out of every three households responded on their own. So we had a final self-response rate of 67%, which exceeded the self-response rate of 66.5% from the 2010 census. But we took advantage of a longer self-response period to push those numbers up. Just under 80% of those who self-responded responded by the internet, and just over 18% by paper, and another 2% by the other self-response option, which was the phone. I won't say a whole lot about the internet self-response tool, but I will say that there was no downtime whatsoever. The system ran flawlessly for many more months than we had planned to have it open. So really proud of the team that put that together, and I think it is one of the main successes of the census. But that's not the only place where we successfully deployed new technology and automation. So it was a huge help that we had iPhones in the hands of our enumerators, that they got their case assignments, their routes to the housing units they needed to enumerate were optimized using software, and they did all their data collection and recorded their hours and miles on the phones. And this resulted in a huge increase in enumerator productivity, with nearly doubled the rate from 2010, 1.9 cases per hour, as opposed to just over 1 case per hour in 2010. And I think that is one of those sort of hidden success stories of the 2020 census that really allowed us to, efficiently and pretty quickly resolve cases out in the field. So of all the addresses across the country that we had to enumerate, we resolved over 99.9% of all those housing units. We either got a pop count from them, or learned they were vacant, or they were not indeed a housing unit. So I'm very proud of the work that we were able to do in data collection for the 2020 census, even with all of the challenges from the global pandemic, from moving our field operations into the heart of hurricane and wildfire season. I think we were able, to successfully use the technology that we deployed to, efficiently, make game time decisions and move things around so that we got a complete and accurate count. But we obviously were very concerned that the pandemic might have impacts on the quality of the data. So last spring, I chartered a group that we call the Data Quality Executive Guidance Group, or the EG, and that's a group that meets regularly with staff to discuss various issues about the count that might impact the quality of the resulting data. In addition, we're working with external organizations to get independent evaluations of our operations and of data quality metrics. So we're working with the American Statistical Association on quality indicators, and with the group of expert academics known as the JASON, who reviewed a number of our processes and procedures and key decisions. It's a group that's worked with government agencies for many decades on large, complex problems. And so great to have their assistance. But, we are now in the process of working with ASA, looking at a bunch of operational and quality metrics to make sure that, these are things that we've hoped to release along with our data releases for apportionment and for redistricting to give the public a good sense of the quality of the data. But the ASA folks are helping with an independent assessment of that. So, I think looking back, we're pretty, we're proud of our accomplishments. Maybe a little bit surprised that we got things done so completely and efficiently. But we're happy to be where we are right now, I think. So we're on schedule to release the apportionment data at the end of April, and we're also going to be releasing the redistricting data no later than September 30th. So excited to be at the part of the stage where we're finally getting the data products compiled and put together. I will say right now, from my vantage point, everything looks pretty good. The quality of the census is, I think, on par with those in the past. We've been releasing blogs and stuff discussing this. I won't go into too much detail there, but I think this is something we're pleasantly, I wouldn't say surprised, but it was a big challenge this year, and I think we were able to come through and do a good census. So just a couple things on presidential executive orders. So the Census Bureau is implementing the President's executive order on ensuring a lawful and accurate enumeration and apportionment pursuant to the decennial census that was released on Inauguration Day. And so, it's important to reiterate that 2020 census data products will not include any information on citizenship or immigration status. We will continue to publish the citizen voting age, or CVAP data, produced from the American Community Survey, as has been done annually at the request of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division since 2011 to support Voting Rights Act enforcement. So later this year, our Census Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office will engage the Voting Rights Section to ensure that CVAP product continues to meet their statistical needs. And all work on immigration status of the population regarding the 2020 census was suspended on January 12th of 2021. So moving off of the census, just real fast, CSAC has a construction modernization working group. So starting in October 2019, working on re-engineering our construction statistics program, which includes 3 economic indicators: building permits, survey construction, and value put in place. And the construction modernization working group has been collaborating with other statistical agencies around the world, actually, in developing new measurement strategies, exploring alternative data sources, including satellite imagery, and leveraging data science techniques in an effort to deliver new and more timely, more granular construction indicator projects. It really is something where I think we're trying to think outside the box and find new ways to measure this important sector. Stephanie Studs will provide a more in-depth look at all the innovative strategies and methods the team's been working on. Hopefully this has piqued your interest for the discussion to come. On differential privacy, we care deeply, as do the members of CSAC, and making sure that we get this right. So, and we really appreciate all the help that CSAC members, in addition to a wide array of data users, have been providing advice to us on this topic. So last fall, you delivered recommendations for this important work and helped us improve the design of the disclosure avoidance system's top-down algorithm, your recommendations regarding the relative prioritization of government funding, legal mandates, and community planning have informed over 600 full-scale experimental runs of the DAS, and we've used these to tune and optimize the algorithm to ensure fitness for use of the redistricting data, and accuracy targets based on those recommendations are now being built into experiments that we're planning for tuning the algorithm for the data supporting the demographic profiles and demographic and housing characteristics files that come out later. So our primary focus to date has been improving the accuracy of population totals and data on Hispanic origin and major race categories for political and legal geographic entities. Our second priority, to ensure fitness for use of the data to support the Census Bureau's population estimates program. So consistent with your recommendations, we've cataloged the diverse use cases supplied to us in the documentation accompanying the detailed summary metrics we release with each set of demonstration data. This has become a critical resource for our stakeholders who are evaluating the improvements we have made in each iteration of the demonstration data. Additionally, we've expanded the detailed summary metrics to make them even more robust, and we developed a detailed glossary to explain the measures, how to interpret them, and how the generalized use cases map to specific use cases that we've received from stakeholders. So the committee's recommendations also highlighted the importance of increased communication and transparency in our ongoing development of the DAS, and we've used frequent the DAS newsletter updates to better communicate about our ongoing activities, and are planning a series of webinars and meetings to help our data users interpret, assess, and provide important feedback on the next set of demonstration data that we will be releasing in April. Lastly, you recommended that we allow sufficient time for additional analysis of the impact of DP on various use cases. We absolutely heard you on this, and we've incorporated time into our 2020 census production schedule to provide more demonstration data to continue engaging with our data users to obtain critical feedback, which will inform subsequent decision-making about the DAS. So on behalf of the Census Bureau, I want to thank the committee for your recommendations and for your ongoing engagement and support as we work together to ensure that 2020 census data products meet our data users' needs while also meeting our obligations under the law to protect the privacy and confidentiality of our respondents' data. So let me just wrap up with a couple comments about the budget. Our FY21 appropriation totals about $1.1 billion. Importantly, this fully supports the Census Bureau's operational needs for this fiscal year, including releasing the aforementioned 2020 census data products, doing the Post-Enumeration survey, full sample for the survey of income and program participation, and further supports releases from the 2017 economic census and planning for the 2022 economic census and census of governments, as well as ACS in all of our current surveys. So that also supports investments in systems and capabilities that will help transform the century from a 20th century survey-centric organization into a 21st century data-centric model that blends survey and administrative and alternative data sources to ensure that we continue to provide the data that America needs. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I think looking forward to the interesting discussions over the next couple of days. I'll have to duck out at a couple of points to take care of various things, but I look forward to the discussions and take any questions you have for the next couple of minutes here.
Thank you very much, Ron. Allison, you want to oversee the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So CSAC members, if you have a question, please use the hands raised feature. Again, if you haven't found that, you click on participants, and then just above sort of near that chat thing, there should be a tiny little hand you would click. And I could ask a question while we're waiting. Ron, I know we're not going to be discussing the Pulse survey, and you know I'm a huge fan, and it's obviously been critical during the pandemic, and then demonstrated value in measuring impacts of disasters like the water crisis in Texas about a month ago. And with places like Jackson, Mississippi, just lifting their boil advisory today, therefore having no water for almost a month. Will the Pulse survey be continuing for another phase? If that was announced, I missed it. And then do you think they could add more questions like about utilities now that we're seeing there's multiple kinds of crises we're facing?
So I don't know if we're planning to do that in this specific instance, and maybe some of my colleagues could chime in whether any of those discussions are having. But in a very real sense, that's what we're hoping to accomplish with the sort of model of the Pulse survey is the ability in very quick, very short time frame to stand something up for special data collections that address a particular need. So in this case, it could be that we add some questions to address the problems in Texas and in the other southern states that are impacted by that winter weather, or hurricanes or what have you. The model is there. But a lot of this will come from, all the stakeholders that we work with on the Pulse surveys that have the data needs. And so I don't know if Tori's on or anything. She might want to jump on and say if there's any discussions, but I don't know if we had those discussions or not. So, but that's the model anyway.
Ron, I am on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So, Allison, we are going to continue the Pulse. We are taking a break for about 2 weeks, and then we'll be introducing new content. I'm just looking through really quickly to see if utilities will be in the new questionnaire. But Ron's exactly right. The Pulse survey and the Business Pulse survey, the household, were designed to quickly be able to change questions so we could measure things real time. So thanks for asking about it because we're very proud of it.
Excellent. I'm very proud of it too. Really, I think you guys know I'm the biggest fan. It's just, fantastic to do something like that in a post-disaster setting, and the timeliness is critical, and that it's timeliness slightly over accuracy, but that's the point, right? So thank you all for doing that. I know it was a labor of love. Did anybody else have a question they wanted to ask? I don't see any hands raised. So maybe, I know we're a little bit over time. Maybe it would be better to move on to the 2020 census update.
All right. Thank you very much, Allison and everyone. Now we'll hear from Al Fontenot and Deb Stemkowski, who will present for up to 30 minutes on the 2020 Census Operational Review, and they will be followed by discussant one, Pablo Jorquet, and committee discussion, and that will total up to 15 minutes. Al and Deb?
Good morning. I'm Al Fontenot, the Associate Director of the Decennial Census Program, and I'm calling in from Upper Marlboro, Maryland, and I'd like to extend a remote welcome to the continuing, leaving, and new members of our Scientific Advisory Committee. The last time we presented an update to the 2020 Decennial Census status to you was in September 17th, 2020, and we were about 6 months into the COVID-19 pandemic. We were still in our non-response follow-up field data collection operations. Today, about 6 months later, we're in the process of preparing for the calculation of the apportionment results and the presentation of the data to the Secretary of Commerce, the President of the United States, and the American public. This morning, Deb Stemkowski, the Assistant Director for Decennial Census Programs, Operations and Schedule Management, and I will be partnering to provide you with a high-level update on the progress we have made and on where we are today, on where we're going in the days, weeks, and months to come. We'll be followed by other members of our leadership team. Michael Thiem, Assistant Director of Decennial Census Programs for Systems Contracts, and Barbara Lopresti, the Chief of our Decennial IT Division, will provide some deep dives into the schedule and status of our post-enumeration processing activities. As multiple people have said, and as you know, 2020 was a very unique year. On March 10th, 21 days before Census Day, the Census Bureau Crisis Management Team, after assessing the early data on the COVID-19 virus spread, declared COVID-19 a major crisis for the 2020 census and began to review and prepare to implement contingency plans for potential disruption in our operation. On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. 2 days later, on March 13th, the U.S. government declared a national emergency. And 1 year ago today, March 18th, in support of guidance on what we could all do nationwide to help slow the spread of coronavirus, all 2020 census field operations were suspended for 2 weeks. As it turned out, COVID-19 necessitated that we extend that suspension several times and replan all personal contact activities such as field training and data collection. As the crisis grew, we were forced to do multiple replans and reschedules of our operation in an effort to both meet our constitutional requirements to conduct a complete and accurate census and at the same time protect the health and safety of our staff and the American public. For example, operations that have been planned throughout the decade to be conducted beginning in April and finishing in July, such as non-response follow-up, our largest field data collection operation, had to be pushed back to start in late July and finish in mid-October. Some of those changes pushed our field operations right into the heart of what became one of the most severe hurricane seasons that the Gulf states had experienced in recent memory. As if wind and flooding were not enough, the country faced unparalleled wildfires along the West Coast in California, Oregon, and Washington state. These fires necessitated evacuations and created conditions where the air quality was deemed so hazardous that people across multiple states were advised to stay indoors. These conditions brought damage, affected the U.S. population, including our field staff, and temporarily impacted our ability to conduct field operations and make progress enumerated the impacted geographic areas. But because of effective contingency plans, we were able to adjust our schedules, replan our operations, move our staff, and keep our teams focused on our mission to conduct a complete and accurate census of all persons living in the United States. When we last met, we were planning on completing field operations by September 30th, and we had developed a schedule that would allow us to successfully conduct a complete and accurate census and meet our statutory deadline of December 31st, 2020 for the delivery of the apportionment counts, if everything worked out perfectly. Ron Jarman calls that the happy path. I call it the best case scenario, but you get the idea. Notwithstanding the operational flexibilities and the aggressive work schedules, the delays that we continued to encounter eventually made it impossible to complete the apportionment counts by the statutory deadline of December 31st, 2020, and provide the redistricting counts by March 31st, 2021. As a result of 90 to 120-day delays in field data collection activities and collection challenges in our processing operations, which Michael Thiem will discuss in detail later in the presentation, the Bureau developed a schedule which established April 30th, 2021 as the date we will deliver the apportionment counts to the Secretary of Commerce, the President, and the people of the United States. Our original plan was to deliver the redistricting data in state groupings starting February 18th, 2021, and finish by March 31st, 2021. Clearly, the COVID-based delays made that schedule no longer operative. Our team laid out the balance of the schedule that would provide the delivery to the states of a complete and accurate set of redistricting data files. That plan is to deliver the redistricting data as a single national delivery to the states and to the public by September 30th, 2021. This is problematic for some states, and we're continuing to evaluate our processes and our plans and look for ways to provide redistricting data as early as possible. Through this evaluation, we recently determined that we can provide what we're calling our legacy format summary files in mid to late August. These legacy format summary files are a product that was always intended to be published as part of the 2020 census redistricting data. They will have been fully reviewed and will contain the same data we plan to release by September 30th. However, the time in our schedule between their completion in mid-August and our announced September 30th delivery is there to allow us to create the tools and materials that most data users will need and expect from the Census Bureau to access the data in which they are interested. The legacy format summary files, as we're calling this early release, will require additional handling and software to make the data easily accessible. It is our hope that state resources, longtime census data users, and vendors will be able to support states in their efforts to use these files and therefore provide some relief from the burden that delayed publication of the redistricting data has placed on the states. From a technical perspective, these legacy format summary files are actually a series of text files for each state, 4 per state. One is a file containing all the geographic information, and 3 files which contain the redistricting data counts. These sets of files need to be used together in order to extract data for a specific location or a specific geography, such as a county. Using these together requires importing the text files into the user's software, connecting the tables to each other, and then creating an extract of these tables to isolate the data and geography the data user wants to see. On the other hand, the user-friendly tools and materials that we intend to deliver in September are DVD flash drives and our Data Census Gov Data Explorer platform. The DVDs and flash drives will have an integrated software browsing tool that will allow intuitive browsing of the data. They'll also contain a custom extraction menu that will allow for the extraction of large data sets from the device. Those extractions can be then imported easily into Geographic Information System or a database. The datacensus.gov User Data Explorer is a data browsing tool where data users can access many different census data sets, including the redistricting data. It has custom filters that allow the user to filter on those geographic and characteristic data for which they are interested. For example, a state could filter the data and easily identify the number of voting age residents by race or ethnicity in each and every block within a census tract, county, or even for the entire state. Data users can view, map, and download these data sets once they have set the filters with their choices. The combination of a data disk, a web-based tool, and the legacy summary files was how we delivered this data to the states and to the public in the 2010 census. Although for 2010, these products were released simultaneously. The DVDs were provided to the official recipients of the data, the governors, the legislative leaders, and the redistricting commissions. The web-based tool and the legacy summary files were made available to the public. Despite the split in the delivery time we're now implementing for the 2020 census, this is still our intention. In August, we will post the legacy summary files for everyone, the states and the public. In September, we'll provide DVDs and flash drives to the official recipients and provide the datacensus.gov Data Explorer for everyone to use. Now, that's a high level of where we are today. Now let me turn it over to Deb Stempowski, who will give you a detailed recap of how we successfully finished our field data collection operations. Deb?
Hi. Thanks, Al, and good morning to the committee. Glad to be with you all this morning. And certainly glad, going back to what Al said earlier, that we are not 1 year ago today when we decided to stop field operations. That certainly kind of gives me a melancholy feeling when I think about that. But let's go back to some of the summary statistics on self-response. Some of these Ron has just mentioned. So originally we were going to end on July 31st, but we did extend when the non-response follow-up operations were extended in the field, and kept self-response operations open until October 15th. And that certainly enabled us then to have a self-response rate that was upwards of almost just past that 66.5% from 2010 at 67%. So 67%, that means over 2/3 of all the housing units responded, self-responded, and I think you all are familiar with, we always say that's the highest quality response. Over just about 80% of those came in on the internet, over 18% on paper, and the balance there on phone. And I don't have it on the slide, but I was taking notes when Allison was talking. 17.7 million of those came in via non-ID, and that was just about double what we had planned for that workload to be. So certainly that's an innovation that I think enjoyed great success, and we will continue to refine moving
through the decade. There's always there's a bit of fun, I admit, when we watch the self-response rates, and states do as time goes on. So 14 of those states had a self-response rate at or above 70%, versus just 7 in 2010. 47 of them were above 60%. 47 were in 2010, and then 28 states met or exceeded their final 2010 self-response rate. So I have to admit that, you know, being an operations junkie, that it was nice to have something to see every day as we were getting used to working remotely at home and not being with our census colleagues during peak operations. So I'm going to move now to non-response follow-up. The core operation, as you're aware, ended up being moved from its originally planned date in early May to July 31st. That was moved backwards to begin in earnest August 9th, preceded by soft launching beginning July 16th. Certainly the soft launch is a best practice that we grew to know and love in the census, a great way to turn an operation on slowly and get things rolling nationwide. And that August 9th date reflects when all offices were open and rolling in NRFU, and we completed NRFU, as you know, on October 15th. That operation had a workload of 60.8 million housing units. That includes more than just non-responding households. We have other kinds of things in the workload, like field verification if we can't match a non-ID address, for example. Out of that 60.8 million, 6.3 million of those households actually self-responded after getting what I call the most expensive mailing, the notice of visit placed on their door by an enumerator. And that usually engages folks to say, well, I don't want a census taker to come back. Why don't I go ahead and fill out the census? During our NRFU operation, we also determined 13.5 million housing units were vacant and 10.3 were non-existent. And we successfully enumerated 30.7 occupied housing units, with most of these, just over 55%, coming directly from the householder. About 7.4 million responses came from a proxy, such as a neighbor, a rental agent, a building manager, or another knowledgeable person. And they helped us get basic information about the occupants so we could close that case. And approximately 24.1% of all completed occupied housing units were enumerated using information from a proxy, which compares to 23.8, the final proxy number in the 2010 census. Additionally, 6.3 million occupied housing units were completed using high-quality administrative records. That's about 13.9% of the non-responding follow-up workload, which is lower than the number where we modeled that we could use the administrative records, which was 22.5%. Additionally, as a result of many of these technological changes and innovations, we were able to achieve a enumerator productivity of 1.92 cases per hour, and that exceeded our planned rate of 1.55 cases and was almost twice our 2010 productivity rate. So in summary, let me go to the next slide, Chris. I like to call this could always be the bottom line up front in any presentation. So despite all of the challenges and obstacles that 2020 has posed, and Al listed out, it wasn't just COVID, but there were quite a few other challenges. Data collection has been very successful. So now I want to talk just a little bit about the factors that enabled us to be successful based on what was happening. First, we were fortunate that self-response had begun, albeit just begun, on March 12th at the time of the work suspension. Almost all the addresses had received their initial invitation to respond or a questionnaire at the time, at this time 1 year ago. Critically, of course, we had our internet application up that we could count on, and we didn't have downtime there. And while our telephone and data processing centers did experience closures due to COVID-19, we were able to staff the facilities to accept responses. Both the phone centers as well as the paper data capture centers were shifting to implement social distancing guidelines as it was happening. So if you think back to where we were and COVID was rolling out and guidelines were coming out, we were implementing almost real time, which seemed we were going to get it done. But when I think about it in retrospect, it makes me even more proud that we were able to shift and adjust to keep things going. From a field data collection perspective, the phased restart for the in-person collection efforts enabled us to get started, and that not only gave us perspective of, that tools and operations were running, but it also gave us perspective of being on the ground in communities and having people knock on your door during the climate that we were in at the time. We resumed our work, and I know Al went over that in our previous meeting in the fall, when it was safe and where it was safe. And for the safety of our field staff, we transitioned classroom training to virtual training. We tried to minimize face-to-face interactions to only the most essential things, such as picking up your iPhone, for example. And we implemented the use of PPE, social distancing, and small group interactions across the board, and that became our norm. We were able to institute some pay flexibilities to minimize the turnover of our staff. And I think mostly what I wanted to focus on, and I actually spent a little bit of time, for those of you on the committee when Jack Levis was on the committee, I went back and I looked at something from December of 2018. And Jack was the discussant during the meeting at that time. So what the Census Bureau did to enable success here was develop creative solutions to the challenges that we had, and we started repurposing components, tools, and operations that we had built to address, to address the original design and adapt them to the changing world. We kept in our minds how we could leverage that original plan and design to keep things going, and of course, the Census Bureau had contingency funding that we could use as needed. So when I went back and looked at that presentation that I referenced, in December of 2018, we had just come out of our 2018 end-to-end test field operations, and we were giving an overview of what happened. And Jack was the discussant that day, and he's another self-proclaimed operations guru. And there were a couple of things that stood out there, and I hope the broader CSAC, who has been with us through the decade, but feels the pride in the successful design of the census. You shaped it and formed it. Jack gave a few bits of advice. One was, in every large project, issues are going to arise. Seems like a giant understatement now. And he told me at the break, just make sure you have good issue management. And we used religiously our crisis management and our issue management, change control processes, et cetera, to get us through this changing environment. But I found this other point very, very timely, and I'm not sure why he put it in, but it said the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And to me, our main thing was then, and was through all of our decisions and how we moved ahead, a complete and accurate census. So he had amazing foresight to give advice there, but certainly seemed very applicable when I did a little retrospective look back. So I think that this in summary is how we were able to keep the progress going. And I'm going to turn it back now to Al, who's going to talk a little bit about post-collection processing.
Thank you very much, Deb. As soon as our field data collection operations were completed, we began tabulating and processing that data. As you probably know, turning all the response data we've received into usable statistics is complex work, and this work is guided and controlled by our statistical quality standards. As I indicated earlier, Michael Thiem will provide more information on our post-processing in the next presentation, but let me take a moment and give you a high-level overview. We start by taking all the responses we've received across response modes, and we had multiple response modes in the census: online, with and without an ID, on paper, with and without an ID, by telephone, with and without an ID, collected by Enumerator, through administrative records. but we take all operations, all modes, GQs, housing unit, and we integrate that data with our information about addresses. We then follow established statistical methods for verifying whether we have a response for every address. We then follow that up with resolving duplicates and filling in missing information. Just as we did during data collection, we're continuously checking the quality of the data throughout the data processing operation. As with all prior censuses, we have found some data quality issues as we were processing the data. However, we have not uncovered anything so far that would suggest that the 2020 census will not be fit for its constitutional and statutory purposes. The Census Bureau is working to thoroughly correct and address any issues and anomalies that are uncovered during processing. Michael will talk about what we found and how we've resolved those issues this afternoon. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to adjust our data processing schedule. We have made some adjustments to deliver results as close to the statutory deadline as possible without taking any action or omitting any activity that would prevent us from producing a complete and accurate quality census result. We've shifted some processing steps that would normally happen sequentially to do them in parallel, and our staff has worked tirelessly to maximize staff and production time. We added resources, system resources, experienced analysts from other parts of the Bureau, internal programmers, and experienced contractors to our post-data collection processing team to ensure we deliver timely and accurate results. Once the data is processed, we're able to produce the data products that many of our customers, from the President and Congress to local elected officials to small businesses and educators, rely on. I want to provide you with a quick glance at the first tier of 2020 Census Data Products plan. If this were a typical decade, we would have already delivered the apportionment counts and would have already started delivering redistricting data to the states. However, as you know, this has not been a typical decade. We have cleared many hurdles in processing the data for apportionment, and we are on schedule to deliver an apportionment count that is complete and accurate by April 30th, 2021. While apportionment has been a main focus, we have not lost focus on our other first-tier data products. After we accomplish the goal of delivering our apportionment counts and fulfilling our constitutional mandate, we'll turn our attention to identifying the activities and schedules needed for producing and delivering accurate and complete redistricting, Public Law 94-171 data for the states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico as expeditiously as we can. As I mentioned earlier, we're expecting to make available a legacy data file as early as mid-August and to deliver the full redistricting data product complete with all the tools and easy access as a single national delivery to the states and the public by September 30th, 2021. Planning for the production and release of the remaining 2020 census data products, including demographic profile and the demographic and housing characteristics file, will restart immediately following completion of the apportionment and redistricting data planning activities. Now let me turn it back over to Deb to talk about a subject that is critical to everything we do, data quality. Deb?
Great, thanks, Al. So knowing that the COVID pandemic might pose data quality issues for the 2020 census, as Rob said, he chartered the Data Quality Executive Guidance Group last April to ensure that we had the right focus and the right resources dedicated to detecting and addressing data quality issues. The EGG draws upon expertise across the Census Bureau between operations, statistical methodology, acquisition, administrative records, and across all of the subject areas in subject directorates inside the Census Bureau. Here you can see the working groups. These are special teams with expertise from within the entire Census Bureau in these fields. Some of them have been assembled, and some of them were already existing, and we decided to add some bandwidth, or, for example, like the current surveys field experience team, there we added an entire team who could provide us a different perspective and give us input as we were changing field operations. The EGG is also working on a couple of other things, a lot of other things, but a couple of other things that I'm going to talk about on the next slide, which include some of the plans to release metrics earlier than ever. including with our constitutionally mandated data, as well as our external expert group work. So we can dig into those topics a little bit more deeply. As you know, it takes time to assess just how accurate it is for the census, and that evolves over time. When we find out things we know, we want to move it along, and we'll share that through the process. And as we're moving through our processing operations, we're getting right to the point where we're going to have more information that we can provide and share. A critical component that Ron touched on of our work is the engagement of the external expert groups as part of our commitment to transparency, and then couple that with sharing what we know when we know it. It's very timely and supports that briefing that you'll have later this afternoon from Sally and Dan from Jason. Our strategy for external experts was really designed to provide assessments on different aspects of the program on a different timeline. So first, in order to get quick turnaround feedback on our processes, procedures, and metrics, we engaged with the Jason Group. They're an independent group of technical experts that advise the federal government on scientific matters. And like I said, you'll hear from them on their report. They did all of their work. We briefed them at the beginning of January, and they produced a report in the middle of February. So that was definitely quick turnaround. Second, more of a real-time assessment by the team of experts that you've heard of from the American Statistical Association on quality indicators. And when I say real-time, I mean on a similar pace as the Census Bureau is completing and releasing its findings. And they post regular updates on their work on the ASA website. And then third, longer term, looking out, that assessment, we're in the early stages of establishing a consensus panel with the National Academy of Sciences that will conduct an evaluation of the quality of the data from the 2020 census. This panel will follow the process that some of you are likely familiar with, where they hold public sessions to gather information on the 2020 census data. They'll, based on those sessions and additional information gathering, working with the Bureau and their expert opinions, they'll hold internal deliberations and produce a consensus report. So those are the three external expert engagements and kind of the strategy behind having each of them do something on a different time frame and somewhat different focus. And then closing this out, critical for getting folks comfortable with the quality of the 2020 census. The Census Bureau continues to assess its own work. As you likely know, the Bureau released the demographic analysis results back in December. And we will, for the first time, be releasing earlier sets of operational metrics than we've done in any previous decennial census. Some will be on the same day as apportionment, and then we will also release metrics moving out towards syncing up with those redistricting data products that Al talked about. In the next couple of days, we will be releasing publicly, actually as part of the blog series. I don't want to steal Al's thunder, but as part of one of the blogs that will be released on quality indicators, we will also put out a table shell that will show folks what information will be available at the state and national level in terms of operational metrics on apportionment day. And then moving on to the next slide, Chris, if you can do that. So evaluating our process, for those of you who've worked on the decennial census before, this slide probably strikes you as familiar. We've long had a robust evaluation and assessment process that supports the census. This isn't new, and certainly we're going to continue that tradition. This has been a part of every decennial census since 1950, and the Bureau incorporates its testing, evaluation, and experiment program to evaluate not only the current census, but to also facilitate planning for the 2030 census, which is hard to get your head around now, but this is when we start the process for that. Our assessments are designed to document different things like volumes, rates, costs, et cetera, from different production files and activities and information that we collect from things like debriefings and lessons learned. And then our evaluations are designed to analyze, interpret, and synthesize the effectiveness and efficiencies of different components and their impact on data quality and coverage. So I share this slide today. I put just a handful of examples on here. This is what we've generally done to talk about how the census went and different aspects in the light of assessments and evaluations. But different for this census based on the focus on quality. We will be releasing some table-style metrics, I'll call it, with our apportionment and redistricting data. So, Al, I think now I'm going to turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Deb. As Deb mentioned, one of the recommendations that the Jason report made was the implementation of improved communication strategies that explain the 2020 census in a way that builds confidence that the Census Bureau will achieve an accurate count and that the data the Census Bureau provides will be usable for the needs of the local governments, for businesses, for state and federal governments, for dispersion of funds. The Jason report also recommended that we ensure that our post-data collection processing schedule allows adequate time for complete, accurate, and transparent processing of the data. To that end, we planned a series of blogs written by internal experts, career census staff, about the quality and progress of the 2020 census. This blog series and associated briefings, press releases, press availability, and announcements of our dates for producing the apportionment and redistricting data all reflect our agreement with these recommendations. So far, we have published 7 blogs on topics such as post-processing, data quality, and group quarters enumeration. On this slide, you'll see a list of the blogs we have published and the upcoming blogs that are in the planning stages. As you can see, these blogs cover a variety of topics, and we continue to revisit and add more blogs and other communications as necessary. If you can see coming up, we're looking at admin records, subject matter expert review process, letting people get an inside view behind the curtain of how we review the data. Introduction quality indicators, helping them at an early level look at one of the key quality indicators we use in the census. Imputation, how do we account for unresolved housing units? Unduplication, post-enumeration survey, which you know is a survey that will provide a read on the coverage levels that we got in the 2020 census. The apportionment process, director's blog about first 2020 census data release, and then comparison to other benchmarks and release of second table of our quality metrics. Those are coming up, and at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Tommy Wright for Q&A, and then to Juan Pablo, CSAC. Tommy?
Thank you very much, Al and Deb, and I'm going to turn it over to Allison.
Yep, thanks. That was great. Juan Pablo, let's give it to you.
All right. So I guess it's good afternoon on the East Coast. Good morning for everyone else. And let's see if we can get the slides up for my presentation. But again, I'll introduce myself again, Juan Pablo Orcad from the University of Iowa. And I am the respondent for this presentation. And even as the slides go up, I just want to get started with expressing appreciation for the leadership and decennial census programs for really being very calm, collected, and effective in facing, I think, what is perhaps the worst possible combination of challenges that a decennial census has ever faced. So strong appreciation there for the leadership, and also strong appreciation for all the people who did all the work, all the folks who participated in the non-response follow-up, for example, during a pandemic. It's quite an effort, and with many successful outcomes, as we just heard. And I also appreciate the consistent dedication to the quality of results that we've seen throughout the process. So I wanted to start there. Let's move on to the next slide. And as Deb Stempowski was saying, the main thing is quality, quality of the census, of the decennial census, and again, I think there's a good game plan for ensuring quality, and I particularly appreciate the efforts with transparency and quality metrics, and also the part of that being the engagement with scientific and professional organizations, as was just outlined. I think that's going to bring both ensure quality, but also bring higher levels of trust in the outcomes. All right, next slide, please. So looking at recommendations and some questions now, these are my personal ones. So as a computer scientist, I like playing with data, so I did download the self-response rates as of October 15th and combine them with some ACS demographic data. And the good news is, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, that overall self-response rates actually went up from 2010. And there were some good highlights of some demographic areas where they clearly improved. Some other areas didn't do so well, some other geographies. So, for example, if you look at rural majority-minority counties and tracts, I think there's some there were some concerns there where there's significantly lower self-response rates compared to 2010. And I think the key thing there, as the quality assurance process goes through, is to make sure that there's no differences in quality between these geographies and those with higher self-response rates, in particular trying to avoid undercounts in those spaces. I think one important area to consider when thinking about 2030, but also all of the other work that the Bureau does in between, is to do research to understand the reasons behind the lower self-response rates in certain locations. And there may be many possible factors at play. 2020 was a most unusual year in terms of challenges, but there's going to be a need to separate pandemic-related issues from, for example, issues related to the switch to internet first in most locations. So those are some issues to think about and to consider as we move forward to better understand the impact, in particular, of moving to use more technology. So those are all my comments, and I just wanted to turn it over to the rest of the committee now for additional comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Juan Pablo. Committee members, if you can use the raise hands feature, that would be great. I don't see them at the moment. I'm going to continue to look. I guess I will jump in with a question since I don't see anybody else with one right now. So, it'd be helpful to know, the original COVID plan, as it was called, quote unquote, right, was for delivering the redistricting data by July 31st. And by the way, the CSAC really supports you all in taking all the time you need, right? So in the case of this data, accuracy is critical and timeliness less critical. So glad you're taking more time, and but wondering if you can tell us a little bit about why the redistricting data is being pushed back a couple months from that original thought of July 31st. Was it that you got what, double the number of non-ID responses, or you're working more on differential privacy and working that out, and just thought it might be helpful for transparency's sake, to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, hi, Allison. This is Alphonse now, and I will take a start at that. One of the things that happened along the process was we prioritized certain activities to get the apportionment data done, which took some activities that would have been done for redistricting and pushed them back in the cycle. We probably lost 30 to 45 days of time by not running those activities, but picked up the time on the apportionment, which was our first constitutional mandate. So that was one of the challenges that occurred along the way. The other thing that we did was I wanted to give a date certain to the states that we would not fall after. And one of the things we had heard up until we released that date from states was what was important to them was to know the latest point they would get the data, when they would get that data. We wanted to say if things happen, and our experience going through the decennial response file 1, decennial response file 2 said anomalies have happened as they had in prior censuses. They take time to fix, time to test, time to deploy, and time to ensure that the deployed fixes don't mess anything up in the process. We wanted to build in some time in the redistricting data file bills to ensure that we were able to catch anything that may have come up. And so in the process of doing that, there is about 60 days longer than there is on the apportionment data file. Any one of my staff want to add anything on that, Michael or Deb?
I think you covered it well, Al.
Yeah, I agree.
Excellent. Great. Okay, great. Let's see. Bill Clark has a question. Go ahead, Bill. Take yourself off mute.
I did. Just a follow-up on that question about apportionment and redistricting data being delivered to the states. I'm wondering what potential impact that could have on the timing or the ability of states to redraw their congressional district lines, in as much as, you know, some states will gain a seat or lose a seat and have to redraw those lines. Is the delay in delivery, how is that going to impact the state's task to do those things?
Hi, this is Al Fosno. On the line with us, we have James Whitehorn, who's the chief of our redistricting data office, and I'm going to ask James if he can come live and talk about that, because he's personally been in contact with a lot of the states, and he can give you a direct insight in terms of how that's impacted states. James, are you on and available?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah, so as this is James Whitehorn. As Al mentioned, we have been trying to talk to as many states as we can about their situations. We've been trying to understand the impacts of the delays in the delivery of the data to the states. And as you can imagine, with our governing system, each state has its own challenges. There are some states that have constitutional challenges that they'll have to overcome. There are states that have statutory challenges. And so there's not really a way to say exactly how this is impacting the states, because it impacts them all differently. There are some states that don't intend to redistrict until 2022. But our hope is that by providing the earlier data set that Al did a great job of describing, that will buy back some of the time that they need, since that is a complete, fully reviewed set of Public Law 94-171 data. We've conferred with a lot of the vendors and with some states directly about that data format, and they're comfortable with using that. And so we're doing what we can there. But it's difficult to say specifically how any given state is affected without looking at their unique situations.
Great, thanks. Excellent. Thanks for the question too, Bill. Okay, CSAC members, I don't see any other hands. If I'm going to wait just another second, but okay, we got John Chaika. Go for it.
John Chaika. This is a question, I think, for Deb. You mentioned that the use of administrative records in non-response follow-up came out fairly short of what you had been projecting. Do you have a sense yet of why it was so much lower?
I don't think we have an official sense of why it was so much lower. We had modeled what was eligible, so where we knew we could use the records. I think it would all be speculation at this point. You know, we had a longer collection period. That's what comes to my mind. So we had more opportunities for people to self-respond, et cetera. But I think that's something that we'll dig into as we continue to move through post-collection and do different kinds of evaluations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, well, we're running behind, and it's probably my fault from the very intro, so we'll move on. We're going to continue talking about 2020 census, so I think we can go to the next topic.
Tommy Wright, thank you very much, Al, Deb, Juan Pablo, and everyone for the discussion and the presentation. Now we will hear from Michael Thiem and Barbara Lepresky, who will present for up to 30 minutes on post-enumeration data processing status, followed by discussant Jay Bright and committee discussion, which will take up to 15 minutes. Michael and Barbara.
Right. Thank you, Tommy, and we will try to stay in that timeline. This is Michael Thiem. I'm the Assistant Director for Decennial Census Programs for Systems and Contracts, and we're going to go through some more specifics about the things that you've Al, Deb, and Ron, as a matter of fact. And my goal for this session is for you to sort of get more to the inside baseball thought and inside the Census Bureau thinking about how we actually get the processing done. So Barbara Lepresky, who's our chief of our decennial IT division, is going to start us out and talk about the process and the schedule for what we've been doing for the last few months. So Barbara, can you start your section?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Hi, everybody. It's Barbara Lepresky, chief of the decennial IT division. If whoever's doing the slides, if you could move forward, that's great. Thank you. This graphic is a representation of our post-data collection processing workflow. On the top there, you see the various steps that we go through to ultimately deliver our apportionment counts and then redistricting data. There is a couple things I want to mention about this processing flow, the workflow, that each one of these major steps is done in a sequential order. In other words, we don't, for example, start the DRF2 until the DRF1 is complete, and then also that after each step is complete, as part of that process to classify it as complete, we have our subject matter experts from various divisions at the Census Bureau review the data on multiple occasions and identify the data as complete and ready to move on to the next phase. So our processing and review process is iterative throughout each one of these steps in the flow. So let's just take a look at each one of those steps and what they do. Of course, to do a census, we need our collection enumeration universe. And so, as many of you are familiar, we have a very robust geographic program that does their processing throughout the decade, working with partners, USPS, our Postal Service, as well as local partners, other sources of data to produce the most accurate and complete geographic foundation we've ever had in the MAP Tiger system. For the 2020 census, we had over 152 million addresses that were included in our final collection universe. And so that, provided our foundation for our addresses. And then moving to the next phase that we call the DRF1 or the decennial response file 1. This is the first file that is produced after data is collected, and the first file during our processing workflow. This provides the foundation for all of the subsequent steps. So I cannot overemphasize the critical nature of getting the DRF1 right. The basis of the DRF1, it is the integration or linking of the responses we have received with our collection universe, with our addresses. It does include all response data, and at this point in time in the DRF1, we do have our duplicate responses in the DRF1, but it is a complete inventory of all of our addresses that are linked with responses. The DRF1, that processing happens at a state-based level. And here it does provide our foundation for the subsequent steps. So here we standardize and normalize all of the data collection modes, phone, internet, paper, data from non-response follow-up, and so forth. We classify living quarters as housing units or group quarters. We remove responses from the universe depending on the residence criteria. And we identify some cases where babies had been born after April 1st. So this is doing all of that initial standardization, normalization work once we integrate the responses with the geography. So after we go through our processing and subject matter review on DRF1 and have sign-off, we then move to the DRF2. And this is where we employ our primary selection algorithm to address duplicates. And that primary selection algorithm selects which data from the DRF1 should represent that housing unit in the census. In addition to the primary selection algorithm, we also remove responses that were flagged in DRF1 for the being born after census day, and we go through a very stringent subject matter review on the DRF2. The next step is our census unedited file, or CUF. And in the CUF, we apply our count imputation to all of the cases that have been identified as unresolved in the DRF2. So when we start the CUF, we determine the status for every housing unit as occupied, vacant, non-existent, or unresolved. And for those unresolved cases, we apply count imputation. And the final step in the CUF is to determine the final population count for each address. The next phase is we go into our apportionment count step, where we prepare our input files to be put into our apportionment algorithm, and then prepare all of the materials that are needed for the data release of apportionment. The next phase is the CEF, or Census Edited File, and while in the CUF we resolve our pop counts, in the CEF we apply our edits and imputation to any missing or erroneous values for all items. And at the conclusion of the CEF, we have complete data items for all of the records. The CEF serves as input to our disclosure avoidance system to create our microdata detail file, and I believe others will be talking about disclosure avoidance in more detail. And then finally, we run our tabulation process, which is used for our data dissemination. And then that feeds into our redistricting release, which Al talked to you earlier about this morning. So that is a general workflow process and what is what each step is tasked to complete. The next slide, if you would be so kind to move to the next slide. Anyone? The next slide.
Just a moment, Barbara. This is Shauna Bing. Give us just a moment.
Great. So while they're getting the next slide, let me just tell you that where we are as of today is we are in this apportionment counts phase. And I want to talk to you about this. So these are for DRF1, DRF2, and CUF. Those are actuals that are represented there. For the apportionment preparation and release, we started that on March 12th. And what we're doing right now is the first phase of our apportionment preparation is we take 3 input files, our CUF, our supplemental file, and our federally affiliated count overseas file, and put those 3 files into that apportionment algorithm. We have completed the CUF. We have completed the federally affiliated count overseas file. We are still working on our supplemental file. And what is in that supplemental file, I think earlier it was mentioned that back in the August timeframe, we implemented a replan to try and release our apportionment data as close to the statutory deadline as possible. And one of those operations, the enumeration of transitory locations, was wrapping up at the end of September because we had moved that time frame due to COVID. So what we decided to do as a result of that replan was incorporate our enumeration of transitory locations into a supplemental file for apportionment, and we separated that out. In addition to that, the supplemental file will also include some late address adds that were obtained between September 28th and October 15th, and that was we completed self-response and non-response follow-up, all data collection activities on October 15th, and between September 28th and October 15th, we were getting some additional responses, and some of those were from new addresses. And so we're incorporating those, we call them late adds, into our supplemental file, so we have a complete and accurate census. And then our CEF process will start on April 20th, go through the middle towards the end of June, our disclosure avoidance in the June-July timeframe, then TAB in July and August, and then we go through that redistricting preparation and release phase mid-August through September 30, and then Al talked to you earlier this morning about the plans for that redistricting release and the multiple dissemination activities. So that's all I had to describe the post-collection processing flow and where we are with our key milestones. I know that during our processing and subject matter expert review, we did run into a number of data anomalies, and Michael Thiem plans to discuss that process with you. So I'll turn it over to Michael.
Right, thanks, Barbara. So I have a goal for our discussion here, and I do want it to be a discussion when we get to the question and answer part. Can we get to the next slide? Well, I can start without that. I think one of the things that people, the word anomaly it has been out there this time, and I just wanted to assure everybody that anomalies are by no means a 2020 census phenomenon. They're what we expect and what we prepare for every census, and actually to me, anomaly review and resolution is part and parcel of our census processing. I mean, they're actually so important to it that I've actually, over the last few months, I've come to sort of love anomalies and respect anomalies because essentially they keep us alert, curious, and humble because there's no such thing as a perfect census, and there's also no such thing as a perfect IT system. So what I want to, by bringing you aboard, I want you to, from when I finish hopefully, become more comfortable with that term because it actually is a term, we had the Jason say, well, maybe you should come up with a different term. And for the life of me, I've tried to figure out a better term, but it really is an excellent term to describe what we're talking about with census processing. Like I said, every census has anomalies, and this one's no different. Importantly, the anomalies that we find are not errors in the census, but if we don't find them and don't figure out how to deal with them, they can become errors in the census. So like I said, part and parcel of the actual processing procedure that we go through. So from my perspective and from the Census Bureau's perspective, when you hear about anomalies and you understand what we do with them, it shouldn't raise concerns. It should actually show everybody that what we do is, what our process is, actually works to figure out how to make the most accurate and complete and quality census. And that when we identify and resolve these anomalies, we're actually giving you comforting evidence that we're committed to doing an accurate job with giving you the census data. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to give you some examples of our anomalies, again, to get you inside baseball for the Census Bureau. I'm not sure if there's just a delay or if you guys didn't hear that I need the next slide.
Hi, Michael and Shauna. We heard you.
Okay, sorry. I'll just assume.
Apologies.
No, I'm sorry. I'll just assume you guys have heard every time I say that.
Yeah.
Wow, that's taking a long time.
Yeah, I think we're having a slight technology issue.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, so the total number of anomalies that we've encountered so far in 2020 is 33. And let me talk a little bit about that number as well. We have a huge staff of incredible professionals that understand census data, that understand the communities where we're counting, and that understand data itself. And so throughout this whole census processing period, we actually have a log of everything anybody comes across, anybody in that great team comes across. There could be over 100 things, and I think there, in fact, for this census are over 100 things that people sort of flag as being possible things to look at. And when we get down to it, only 33 of them were things that turned into what we call our anomalies. So let me talk about the types of anomalies. The first type of anomalies we encounter are we call them standard problems that arise in processing any large survey. 27 out of our 33 are those, and an example, or some examples of that type of anomaly are routine coding anomalies, meaning that the processing software we wrote to make sure that we could take that massive amount of data from the American public and put it into tables and information for you to consume. Something was wrong in the code. It could be a little small thing, as I'll give an example, in the code that works that stuff. There could be processing errors in handoffs between systems, and we could have a business rule that's sort of defined not as exactly or as perfectly as when we in the outset we hoped it would be. So an example, and this one I totally agree with the discussant and everybody. We had a little coding error that for some reason miscalculated the age of respondents when they didn't put the full month, day, year into the response that they sent to us. And that meant that essentially we could be miscalculating somebody's age and therefore not be able to match them as well to a possible duplicate. But that was a simple code fix, and that was easy to do. We also had duplicate responses from group quarters addresses. In other words, we would have people that lived in a group quarter, such as a nursing home or a prison or whatever, that actually were able to respond online, but we also had a response from their unit in sort of a group response, for example. That was a duplication, and our code was supposed to handle that by placing that person in the group quarter and not placing them somewhere else. And we, again, a code correction fixed that. So next slide, please.
Hi, Michael, this is Shauna Banks. Just so you and everyone knows, it's advancing on our end, but it seems as though we have a slight delay with the WebEx portion. So
yeah, and I can
be patient with that.
Right, and so Tommy, right, if we run over, let's just blame it on the slides.
Noted.
Okay, so our second anomaly category is anomalies resulting from unanticipated respondent acts, especially with the impact of the pandemic. 5 of our 33 anomalies were of this type. So our great example for this is in a small number of colleges and universities, the total student population in all dorms was submitted by those institutions for each dorm, potentially inflating the population count on those campuses. So this means, for example, if we had, 2,000 people on a campus in all of their 8 dorms, we essentially got the number 2,000 for each of their 8 dorms, essentially turning that university campus from having 2,000 students to having 16,000. Obviously a situation that we did not expect. So a code fix enabled us to distribute the correct population among the college dorms where this occurred. And we also reached out to those colleges and universities to get guidance on that. So that's a good example of something that we didn't expect a respondent to do. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, the third type of anomaly that we've encountered is anomalies resulting from unanticipated enumerator action. So this is our own people doing something that we didn't expect, and this is, for example, our enumerators out in the field. During GQ group quarters enumeration, there were isolated instances in which some enumerators mistakenly set a GQ rework indicator. So this is a flag that an enumerator can set in their work process for one or more persons in a group quarters facility. This actually, as it turned out, invalidated all the responses at the GQ, which is what it was supposed to do, is invalidate. In other words, it was supposed to be a flag that said, go back and redo this whole group quarters, and the enumerator thought that it meant just redo one person. So it was a situation where we were able to fix that, and all the answers were present in our data, but since that flag had been activated, we wouldn't have counted them if there was no work, if there was no rework. So we were able to fix that and essentially take those responses that the enumerator had collected and put them into the census. Next slide, please. All right, so our key message, like I said, I think that the most important thing for you guys to understand is that anomaly does not equal bad. Anomaly equals census doing its job, and the inevitable consequences of any large data collection being essentially figured out and dealt with correctly. As you've heard other people say, we've not run across anything that we've found impossible to fix. And this slide was written a few weeks ago where we said that we are either fixing or have fixed, and in fact we have fixed all 33 of those anomalies. And just to give you a quick preview of what's going forward, we still have processing to do, so there still is the possibility for anomalies, but we haven't run across an anomaly in weeks. And I feel very positive that we have essentially, in our early processes, in the thorough review of our early processes, essentially caught everything that I think we're going to catch from a population count perspective. Going into the CEF, the census edited file, we still have to do all of the very specific processing that has to do with placing the right people in the right geography, not just at the state level, but in the very low-level geography of census block. We have to get all of their correct characteristics correct, race, Hispanic origin, age, sex, all of those things have to be reviewed, and so, more to come, but I have, like I said, very high confidence that we are doing what we need to do to make the census accurate, and that most importantly, we have never in this whole process done anything in favor of time over accuracy. We have always, when faced with a decision between getting it done quickly and doing it right, we have always, and we will continue to always choose to do it right. So I will turn it back over to, I believe, Tommy to take questions. Thank you.
I think it's Allison.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and I'll turn it over to Jay. And Jay, I know you'll do what Juan Pablo did, and I'll ask all the presenters to do this. Even if there's a delay, just keep talking because the slides will catch up. Thank you.
All right, this is Jay Bright. Oh, thank you. Thank you. This is Jay Bright. Thanks to Michael and Barbara for an excellent presentation. Next slide, please. It may be delayed, but I was happy to hear about the processing timeline and the milestones. My overall reaction is just one of relief. As we all know, post-processing takes time. Every census includes new methodologies that have not yet been tested at full scale, and this census was certainly no exception. Every complex operation is going to encounter some unanticipated scenarios, and 2020 had loads and loads of those. And bugs are going to occur even in well-developed and tested software. And as a quick aside here, there exists software that does bug sniffing, sort of automated detection of bad code. It'd be interesting to see how this might work on census processing code. That's an active area of computer science research. Might be worth trying that stuff out on some of the code that had anomalies in it, and maybe going forward, maybe provide that code to the research community that they might be able to test new techniques on that code. At the fall 2020 meeting, CSAC concluded that the compressed post-processing timeline that had been proposed was really threatening the accuracy of the 2020 census. So a common theme throughout our recommendations is we were asking for more time for the census to complete its full suite of processes and not be rushed. And the current processing timeline is consistent with that recommendation, so very happy to hear it. Next slide, please. And echoing Juan Pablo, I wanted to say a little bit about the external review processes and communication strategy. So we're going to hear more about this later this afternoon, including the JSON report. But data post-processing and data quality are tightly coupled. It's hard to separate one from the other. It's really great to see the external review processes that are in place. And what I really wanted to call attention to was the blog posts, the very transparent dissemination of the processing methodology and the dissemination of the external review results. So this series of blog posts is really excellent. They are timely, they're relevant, they're concise, they're accessible, they're extremely well written, quick read. These are terrific. I'm still waiting on the advance of this slide, and I'm ready to go to the third one. Okay, so there's slide 2. So yeah, highlighting the blogs. Next slide, please. And as far as lessons learned, these processes of external review and efforts toward transparency are terrific. And a comment there is just keep up the good work. The only comment is to ensure the future iterations are planned. They're not reactive, and I think that's the case for most of these processes in place. And it's certainly a part of census culture that data quality and external review and transparency are all of paramount importance. I think possibly the ASA, Data Quality Indicators Task Force, was more generated outside the census, but maybe that's my misperception. But having these processes in place, planned and expected, is really terrific. The other comment is to continuously update the test cases for future processing. So we've heard about these different kinds of, now that's one slide too far, but don't worry about it. We've heard about these different kinds of anomalies, including the standard sorts of anomalies that appear in any processing. And I had a comment on the slides about maybe that calculation of age was a fairly surprising one that you would have expected to catch prior to runtime. But the other kinds of unanticipated errors are, unanticipated, difficult to come up with. But having a very extensive suite of test cases could be useful. So the appeal here, I'm sure Census has a suite of test cases, but the appeal here is to make that even more extensive. Think of kind of Anomaly Town, USA, which has problems of every type you might imagine, including various kinds of errors, both ones that have been observed in real data processing, as well as artificial errors that have been constructed to be extreme in different dimensions. In one dimension that you think of those as edge cases, and as you get more and more of these together, you'll have corner cases, as well as different kinds of duplications and of all the different types that might arise, lots of disruptions that displace a large number of cases, along with the desired outputs. So where should these go next? How do you tabulate them, or where should they go next in the processing? And again, Census has all this stuff. This is just an appeal to do this as extensively as possible. Use this in pre-testing, and further use it in regression testing. Whenever you fix a bug, you want to make sure you haven't broken something else in the process. So next slide, please. And my final slide is just a comment that one of the possible sources of confusion and difficulty might have been the definition of the term usually, which shows up in the census when you're asked, does the person usually live? So the slides are a little out of order. That went back to, but the final slide is, does this person usually live at this address? And it's a little hard to know what usually means, because that usually means normally or generally, and it's hard to see that being applicable in 2020. Maybe having some guidance on exactly what the temporal window for usually means, along with some specific examples that highlight disruptions that have been encountered, might be useful for helping people understand what that means, and maybe would have helped with some of the kinds of anomalous situations that arose. So I'll stop there and hand it over to my colleagues.
Great. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jay. And thanks for continuing on despite the slides. I think we need to advance a couple slides. But meanwhile, let's see if any CSAC members have questions. I'm looking down. Oh, I see Tom Brunel. Go ahead, Tom.
Yes, thank you. I was curious about how the whole household and whole person imputation rates compared in 2020 to more recent past censuses. I was curious if the use of administrative records allowed the Bureau to rely less on that sort of tool, but perhaps not. I was just wondering about the rates, comparative rates.
So the rate for the 2010 census for imputation is 0.4%, so less than 0.5%, and we are still at the point, we don't have the rate yet for 2020, but we will certainly share that when we get that. I don't have any indication. I don't know if Barbara has an indication that we're going to have a higher imputation rate at this point, but
no, I don't have that knowledge.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Let's see if anybody else is raising their hand. I'm not seeing that. I'll jump in with a question. Obviously the college students was a particular challenge. It's always a challenge, but a particular challenge. And I envisioned that you might have. I live like a mile walking distance from Tulane University, and lots of off-campus houses with 4 and 5 people. So like if you got a single self-response from an address, would you then consider that counted? And what about the housemate if they responded separately online?
I'm sorry, do you mean at a sort of a group home or something like that, or what is it that you're?
Yeah, so these would be houses that 4 college students rented together. And so it's not a group home, but it's off-campus housing, right? Where, yeah.
I'll throw that one, if Deb is still around. Is Deb still here? Because I mostly work on the back end.
Deb is still here, and actually I think, is Tom Muley still on? He's probably the best person to answer. I hear him. So I think, Allison, just before Tom gets to the answer, or to make sure the whole committee is familiar with the effort we did over the summer to institute collection where we could get the administrative list from a college to reflect the off-campus students to kind of plug that gap. So we had that data set from, I think, almost 600 schools, but I'm going to turn it over to Tom because I saw him jumping in. Or I heard him.
Yeah, Allison, this is Tom Yulee. With the self-responses, the one thing that we were seeing with these self-responses that we were analyzing, we also got information from the university about an off-campus address. We were seeing those self-responses, were pretty complete. They were filling out for their whole household members. So we were seeing those instances. So we do get a self-response for an address, and that would kind of be considered to be a response.
But you were finding them to be pretty complete, like in many cases. How would you know if
we had that same concern that you were raising?
Yeah, and I mean you were checking it against what the universities provided, so that gave you a sense of that they were more complete.
Right. When we were determining if with the information that the universities were providing it to us, we needed to supplement, especially like self-responses that we had got, and when we were seeing that the self-responses were being pretty complete, that led us at least to, with the off-campus data, we used that in our post-processing that if fieldwork determined the address was vacant, delete, or unresolved, then we used the information that the university provided for that address to make sure we weren't undercounting those addresses.
Right.
This is Al Fontenot. I would like to just also interject. In 2010, with a paper form mailed to an address, we would have the same question. If one of the residents of that address filled out the form and did not include their roommates, the same issue would be an impact. And it's something that is not new to the Census Bureau to be concerned about that and be analyzing that.
Got it. Oh, let's go to Rochelle.
Thanks. This is Rochelle.
Go ahead.
I think you can hear me now. This is Rochelle Winkler. I had a very similar question to Allison's. I had my hand up before you, right when you were talking, but maybe a bit more broad. I'm wondering about some of the anomalies that you saw, and if you could speak a little more, any of these anomalies related to, and I'm thinking about counting people in the right place more than anything here, related to movements of people, like college students, over the time when the census was being conducted. And the other group that I was particularly interested in is the snowbird kind of population that spends half the year one place versus another. I'm wondering if we saw anomalies in how those people were counted in 2020 in comparison to past censuses. I know that this group is there's always this question about where you're going to be counted, but I wondered if that is playing out differently, and if you saw any anomalies related to that given the COVID impacts.
So this is Michael. From a system perspective, I think we always have challenges with group quarter situations, but we do have operations designed for the usual home elsewhere and a form, actually a checkbox on the form to sort of flag that for us. But I would turn it over. I don't know if we have somebody from Tori's staff, maybe Karen Battle, on to talk about what they've seen, or maybe even Deb might have some more information about what we've seen in terms of the actual response patterns of people that are responding correctly. In other words, not a system anomaly, but sort of something that's different from the normal expected response pattern because of COVID.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I heard that noise. I wasn't sure what that is. This is Deb. I don't know. I was thinking if Tori is still on, she could talk about it from the analysis standpoint. But I think what Michael was going over in terms of how we try to catch, I'll call it catch those situations during process or during data collection where we're asking people, you know, is somebody here who usually lives or stay elsewhere? We have a dedicated part of collection operations called coverage improvement, where we have a big amount of phone calls that we were making this go around that were triggered by a lot of the college students and their parents filling out the form and saying that they, usually live or stay elsewhere. So that would help us validate that information so we could correct for that. But from, I think, part of what Tori's staff, led by Karen Battle, has done during the analysis is to look at those areas as well, so we could look in and see if there was a particular anomaly. I don't know that there was in this situation, but Tori, if you want to elaborate on the other parts of it, you can.
To weigh in, I think he's on the line, right, Jason?
Yes, this is Jason Devine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I think during our review, we saw, we're seeing, patterns that, we're familiar with the areas that would be, impacted or would reflect kind of the snowbird patterns. We see patterns that, it's hard to sort of distinguish between patterns that reflect growth that occurred over the decade or, growth that are unique because of the COVID-19 situation and how people may have moved due to that. We didn't see patterns that were alarming to the point where we would connect it and link it back to to a data processing issue. But those are patterns that I think will have to be explored throughout the decade as the data is released to the public and people can conduct their own analysis.
Okay. I don't see any more hands, so it's just that gained us a few minutes. So, Tommy, should we move to break?
Yeah. Yes, I want to thank Michael, Barbara, Jay, and I'm going to always remember Anomaly Town, USA. And let's say we'll be back in our seats at about 1:22. 10-minute break. 1:22.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Not yet.
Thank you for standing by, and welcome back from your break. I would now like to turn it back over to Tommy Wright. Thank you. You may begin.
Tommy Wright, thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. I think in a previous meeting of this committee, Tim Kennel referred to the Post-Enumeration survey as the most important sample survey in the world. So we will now hear from Tim Kennel and Pat Cantwell, who will present, taking up to 30 minutes, on the Post-Enumeration survey update. And that will be followed by the discussant, John Chaika, who will be, and the committee discussion, which will total to about 15 minutes of there. Tim and Pat?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wright. Today I have the privilege and honor of providing an update of the most interesting survey in the world. I'm not sure if it's the most important, but it is very interesting, to me at least.
Thank you.
The Post-Enumeration survey. You're welcome, Tommy. So last year I gave an overview of the Post-Enumeration survey, which I'll sometimes refer to as the PES. Today I'll provide some updates on the progress of the Post-Enumeration survey. COVID-19 has changed the world and has had deep impacts on surveys. I'll begin this session with some updates on how the Post-Enumeration survey has changed in response to COVID-19. The focus in this section will be on schedule changes and their implications on the survey quality. After the discussion on changes, we'll have a special treat. I'll provide some early results that have not been made public until now. Then I'll conclude with some remarks on correlation bias. So the first section is on design changes in response to COVID-19. The PES has 5 field collection operations: the independent listing, the initial housing unit follow-up, the person interview, the person follow-up, and the final housing unit follow-up. The first 3 field operations are highlighted in blue because they're finished. Response to the person interview operation was less than desired, so we reopened the person interview last month. As a result of COVID-19, the PES revised its milestone schedule, and here are the original dates for the PES field operations and the revised dates. These dates include both the main operation as well as quality control operations, which typically lag behind the main survey work by about a week. As you can see, the independent listing data collection dates were not impacted by COVID-19. However, the remaining operations were delayed. As we were preparing for the initial housing unit follow-up, the clerical staff that would have performed the initial housing unit clerical matching, which precedes that follow-up operation, were largely sent home as we discussed various modifications to the clerical and field operations during the pandemic last March and April. Durations of the field operations haven't changed much as a result of COVID-19. Most delays to the PES schedule were necessary because field and clerical work could not be done fully in March, April, May, and June of last year. The next, here's some impacts on field interviews. The delays in the previous slide could have an impact on PES quality. Here are some of the errors that have always been part of the PES, but might be increased as a result of these delays. As we're trying to mitigate the impact of these errors and measure some of these errors and measure some of them as well. First, recall error might be increased. As time between Census Day, which was April 1st, 2020, and the PES interview dates increase, people might misreport where they were living on Census Day. Additionally, as more people who are living at a sample address on April 1st, 2020 move out, we would expect less accurate and complete information about the Census Day household from proxy respondents or current residents. An additional measurement error might happen during the person follow-up, which is yet to come, if respondents think the questions were about the household on April 1st, 2021, instead of Census Day, which was a year earlier. We might also have higher item non-response rates if respondents forget to report or don't know about the Census Day household. Lastly, there could be increased unit non-response if people or more reluctant to open their door and talk to an interviewer during the pandemic. The potential for more errors in the PES field collection operations is concerning. However, several things are being done to mitigate these errors, as we will see in a moment. The next slide shows, as a result of COVID-19, we had to delay much of our field and clerical matching work. Our schedule is still somewhat fluid at this point, but we're working towards releasing the first set of reports next winter. The second release is expected in the spring of 2022. We still have a lot of person matching and additional housing unit matching work that will happen in 2021. So we have a lot more work yet to do. The next slide shows that in addition to the schedule changes, a number of other changes have been made to the PES in response to COVID-19. Now I'll go through all of these bullets. First, I'll mention that the PES team is dedicated to quality and takes pride in the many quality checks and resources integrated into these operations. Second, to help reduce the spread of COVID-19, we modified some of our field procedures to minimize contact with respondents. For example, we allowed more listers to conduct the initial housing unit follow-up by observation when a person was not needed to gather the necessary information about the housing unit. We also allowed more telephone interviews in the person interview. Third, to mitigate recall error, we're providing event history calendars to respondents to help anchor the reference date of April 1st, 2020. The calendars will have some regional information about events happening close to April 1st, 2020. And I think this date is probably very salient, more so than other censuses, because there were numerous lockdowns happening right about that same time. Fourth, to help minimize confusion between April 1st, 2020 and April 1st, 2021 for the person follow-up, we added the year 2020 to all questions referencing Census Day and April 1st. Fifth, we're enhancing our review of the data during the estimation phase. We're adding new checks and comparing PES data to additional sources to help us assess and measure the quality of the PES data. Six, we'll be writing a source and accuracy statement for the PES reports. We will also be writing detailed methodological papers and assessments as we've done in the past. The seventh and eighth points are specific changes to the PES field procedures. I'd like to note that the initial housing unit follow-up always had provisions for working the cases by observation. The main goal of the initial housing unit follow-up is to determine if the PES and census addresses exist and if they're the same or not, if there's a match or not. So this work can largely be done by observation, by seeing, oh, this house exists at this address or not, and these two addresses are the same housing unit or not. So that is work that has always, could be done by observation, but we were a little bit more flexible with that. The sixth point is that we're adding a non-response bias report. In the report, we will discuss the impact of non-response on the dual system estimates under a variety of realistic assumptions about the non-respondents. Earlier, I mentioned that we reopened the person interview operation because response was less than expected. Some areas across the country were closed as a result of COVID-19 during the main person interview work back in November and December. And if you remember, the number of cases of COVID-19 and deaths were really spiking during that time period when we were doing our main data collection. Lastly, given the potential for recall error and non-response, especially related to reporting of people's census day, residency, and location, we're investigating what's called any address matching. In any address matching, we increase the search area for dual system estimation. This allows us to find in areas where people didn't report where they were. So we're searching everywhere, not just in a limited block and the surrounding blocks. We've always planned to conduct the computer and clerical matching in a way that would support both any address matching and search area matching. So we're in a good position to look at the data and see which type of matching for the dual system estimation we'll use. We're conducting our matching the same way, which gives us maximum flexibility for however we define the search area during estimation. Those are some of the changes as a result of COVID-19. I'll now show a few tables with results. So when the first is the block sample results. When we selected the PES sample, there were about 5 million blocks in the United States. Of those, 9,800 were selected for sample. After conducting the initial listing of these blocks, we subsampled the blocks without any addresses, or without many addresses. This subsampling resulted in a final sample of 8,200 blocks across the U.S. and D.C. Puerto Rico ended up with about 300 BCUs. Shortly before the independent listing operation started in January of 2020, a major earthquake hit Puerto Rico. This disaster, along with several hurricanes over the decade, resulted in more vacant and small BCUs, which were then subsampled. So the subsampling rate is a little bit larger for Puerto Rico as a result of there being smaller BCUs or blocks. So the next slide shows in the 9,800 PES sample blocks, 513,000 addresses were listed during the independent listing operation. During the clerical matching and follow-up, some addresses were found to be duplicates outside the sample blocks. Were found to be duplicates. Some of the addresses were found to be outside the sample blocks during the follow-up. They were determined to be group quarters. Some were determined to be non-residential and otherwise out of scope. So after removing those addresses that were out of scope, the PES sample contained 484,000 housing unit addresses. Now, of those 484,000 housing units, we found 461,000 in the preliminary census files. These preliminary census files were extracted in January of 2020 before the census had most of their responses. So it was before a response really opened up. So this is not matching to the final census results. It's the preliminary census matching, and these are also unweighted results. So our sample has weight variation, and this is not indicative of the final dual system estimates or what the weighted match rate would be across the country. But this does show you sort of what we're seeing and a glimpse of what the initial results are from that initial housing unit matching phase. I'll go to the next slide. Here we see weighted response rates from the initial person interview data collection. So after considering these rates, we decided to go back to reopen the person interview to try to convert a number of the non-respondents to respondents. This reopening effort will end this week, and we're very optimistic that the response rates will be greatly improved. This table that you're looking at now does not include any results from the reopening effort. I'll note that many surveys would probably be delighted to have results in this table. However, because the post-enumeration survey does not calibrate to any external estimates, it really is essential that the PES be able to independently capture everyone. The PES team and census leadership is focused on quality, and the amazing efforts and expertise that we encountered to reopen this operation should testify to the high standards and expectations for the PES. To be transparent, I will note that we did not reopen the person interview in Puerto Rico. The response rate was within an acceptable range, and also there were quite a few vacant housing units and not a housing unit in Puerto Rico. This is likely a result of various natural disasters, including earthquakes and hurricanes there. So those are some of the early results. We have a lot more work yet to do. Now, I know some CSAC members had some questions and comments about correlation bias, so I'm going to now talk in this section a little bit about correlation bias and what our plans are, which are basically, very similar to what we did in 2010. So I'll show you some things from 2010. In this table, we see the 2010 demographic analysis results. They produced several series of estimates for the total U.S. population, each with a different set of assumptions, mostly related to the magnitude of immigration. One of the strengths of demographic analysis is that these estimates are very timely and do not depend on the census count. The demographic analysis totals were reported in early December of 2010 before the apportionment counts were delivered to the President. For the PES, we use results from demographic analysis to correct for correlation bias. Correlation bias results from a lack of independence between the PES and the census. The correlation bias adjustment is only applied to person estimates. No correlation bias adjustment is made for housing units because there are no demographic characteristics of housing units. So the next slide, we see the formula for the dual system estimator. This formula is the same formula used in 2010 and discussed in numerous publications from the 2010 census coverage measurement. I'll briefly introduce this, but I will refer you to those other sources for a more in-depth discussion on our estimation strategy and the estimators. The pies are probabilities. DD refers to data defined, CE for correct enumeration, and M for match. In showing this formula, I want to highlight the CB term, which is the correlation bias adjustment. The correlation bias adjustment factor is the ratio of two sex ratios. So it's a ratio of ratios. The sex ratio is the number of males to females. In the numerator of the correlation bias adjustment factor is the sex ratio from demographic analysis. In the denominator is the sex ratio from the PES. The correlation bias adjustment factor is calculated for adult males in each age race group. The next slide has the sex ratios used in the 2010 Census Coverage Measurement Survey. The correlation bias adjustment is set to 1 for females and children under the age of 18. Only males have a correlation bias adjustment. This correlation bias adjustment essentially inflates the number of males so that the PES sex ratios are equivalent to the demographic analysis sex ratios. If the calculated adjustment factor was less than 1, we set the adjustment factor to be equal to 1. In age race groups where this occurred, there was no adjustment to the male dual system estimates. There was no correlation bias adjustment for children aged 0 to 17. We do not have evidence from sex ratios to assume correlation bias only for male children. Also, this sex ratio adjustment cannot be used to adjust the dual system estimates for both male and female children. We performed the correlation bias adjustment because historically males were missed from the census and the PES. The correlation bias adjustment boosts the male numbers so that the sex ratios match demographic analysis. We should note that sex ratios from demographic analysis are very stable. Even though the demographic analysis total vary from high to low demographic analysis series, so the totals vary, the sex ratios are fairly similar across the different series. And the slide you're looking at right now, you can see the sex ratios from the 2010 and 2000 demographic analysis, as well as the 2010 and 2000 post-enumeration surveys. For example, the African Americans aged 18 to 29, the post-enumeration survey found 89 males for every 100 females. But demographic analysis said there were 94 males for every 100 females. So we boosted the dual system estimate of black males aged 18 to 29 so that we had a ratio of 94 males per 100 females. It should be noted that the correlation bias adjustment is not applied to females and children. If females were undercounted in the census and the PES, then we would have additional correlation bias in the PES estimates that are not corrected for. Historically, the total number of females from demographic analysis has been close to the dual system estimates, so we haven't applied a correlation bias adjustment for females. It certainly would be possible to control the dual system estimates to the demographic analysis totals. However, then there would be no point in producing dual system estimates of net coverage by sex, age group, and black, non-black categories because they would match demographic analysis. Regarding young children, the sex ratios from the post-enumeration survey have been close to the sex ratios from demographic analysis. That is, we haven't noted that correlation bias for boys is greater than correlation bias for girls. So the historic correlation bias adjustment wouldn't do much for children. Over the course of the past decade, it was noted that the demographic totals for young children was much higher than the 2010 post-enumeration survey. So we think there could be correlation bias for both boys and girls. Also note that the correlation bias adjustment is limited to the breakouts in demographic analysis. Demographic analysis uses historic administrative records such as birth and death certificates. Thus, demographic analysis is dependent on how people recorded race on birth certificates 60 years ago, well before most states allowed people to check multiple races. Additionally, Hispanic origin wasn't consistently collected on birth certificates until, I think, about 30 years ago. Thus, using Hispanic origin in the correlation bias adjustment would only be applied to the youngest age group if we did that. So I hope that provides some context to the correlation bias adjustment as it's currently planned. And I'll be glad to take any questions either now or after the discussion. Thank you.
Great. So our discussant is John Chaika. Would you like to jump in, John?
Yes, John Chaika. Tim, I want to thank you for a very informative update on the PES. Next slide. I'll keep talking. There it is. I wanted to begin by summarizing some basic points about coverage evaluation that are pertinent to my comments. The PES is administered to residents in a representative sample of block clusters, which are listed independently from the master address file, and this constitutes the P sample. The census enumerations in these same block clusters constitute the E sample. These two samples are matched to estimate the correct and incorrect enumerations in the E sample and by extrapolation to the census. Dual system estimation is applied to the two samples to estimate the total population, which is also used in calculating net error and omissions. In censuses prior to 2010, separate estimates were produced within post-strata in order to reduce correlation bias. In 2010, the post-strata were replaced by 3 logistic regression models, which will be used again in 2020. Next slide. The PES interview is designed to determine who is present in each sample household on census day, and it collects the kinds of information shown here. Note that if the people living at a PES sample address have moved to that address since census day, they are asked what they know about the census day residents, and they are also asked where they themselves lived on census day. Next slide. PES interviews ordinarily follow completion of the census interviews, so they always deal with the lag. With the pandemic, the delay was much greater, as Tim showed. He mentioned that this potentially leads to greater recall error and more unit and item non-response. There's also a greater incidence of movers, although this has shown a steady decline from the mid-'80s when 20% of people moved in a year. Next slide. In an earlier paper on the 2010 coverage measurement, Tom Muley presented some statistics on correct and erroneous enumerations and whole person imputations for self-respondents and for the NERFU households broken down by month. It would be incorrect to infer from this that with its late start that NERFO is going to look like the July-August data shown here or worse. On the other hand, it is reasonable to anticipate a greater decline in quality than we have seen here. Next slide. Tim discussed the correlation bias that was applied to the 2010 dual system estimates and what will be applied to 2020. He also mentioned that the 2010 demographic analysis showed a greater undercount of young children than the dual system estimates, which suggest additional correlation bias. This could very well be true again. We hope it's not as extensive as earlier, given the efforts that have been made in 2020 to improve the count of young children. But it does lead to my second recommendation on the next slide, which is that the Bureau explore the possibility of developing an adjustment for this potential correlation bias. In principle, an age-based adjustment could be developed to address that. My first recommendation here is that in developing the logistic regression models, the Bureau should explore the contribution of the data collection month for both the census and the PES, given that these are shown to relate to estimates of census error. I also note in the third recommendation that the Bureau's ability to match records outside of a limited search area has improved greatly since 2000. Tim talked about this. I recommend that in its documentation of the 2020 coverage measurement, the Bureau should clearly identify the universe for each matching operation and how this may have changed since 2010. And lastly, the Bureau should describe how the new disclosure avoidance system will be applied to both the estimation and the publication of the components of census coverage error at the different geographic levels for which these estimates are reported. And those are my comments. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, John. I know that was chock full of good information. Do we have questions from other committee members? I'm not seeing hands up. And of course, John, if you had other questions or comments you wanted to make, if other committee members aren't raising their hands, we'd love to have your thoughts.
John Chaika, I really don't have anything more right now.
Great. Okay. I love my committee members. You guys are the best. So efficient. I think I don't have anything else, Tommy, so maybe we can jump to the next topic.
All right. Thank you very much, Tim, for the most interesting presentation on the most interesting sample survey. Thank you for updating me, and thank you very much for the comments, John, on the discussion. And I guess we're a little bit ahead. I'm speechless. Okay. Next, we'll hear from Christine Hartley and Eric Jensen. They'll take up to 20 minutes to talk on the Population Estimates Program, and their presentation will be followed by a discussant, Rochelle Winkler, and committee discussion, which will last up to 15 minutes. Christine and Eric.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us here today to discuss our plans for producing estimates after the 2020 census. My name is Christine Hartley, and I'm the Assistant Division Chief for Estimates and Projections in the Population Division. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Eric Jensen, the Senior Technical Expert for Demographic Analysis. Although personally this is my first opportunity to present to this group, I know that my program has a history of sharing information on some of our special projects, such as demographic analysis, which Eric presented, I think, just a couple years ago, and earlier last decade, the Population Estimates Challenge Program. And both of those are topics that we'll be discussing again today. We are glad to have this latest opportunity to receive your feedback and recommendations on our plans. So I'd like to begin with some background on our program and what we consider to be our regular processes so that we might then describe some of our anticipated challenges and potential mitigation strategies. So the Population Estimates Program produces annual estimates of the population and housing units for the United States as per Title 13, Section 181. These are the official estimates of population and housing units for the Census Bureau, and they're used to distribute federal funds, develop weights for demographic surveys, and inform the public about changes to the nation's population. We produce a wide array of geographic and demographic detail, which you can see here in this table. To summarize, we produce estimates by demographic characteristics, age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin, down to the county level, and estimates of the total population down to cities and towns. We also have estimates of group quarters by type and housing unit estimates down to the city and town level. Next slide, please. For population estimates at the county level and above, the POP Estimates Program utilizes the cohort component method to measure population changes since the last census through the use of a variety of administrative records on births, deaths, and migration. Sources include the National Center for Health Statistics, Internal Revenue Service, Social Security Administration, Defense Manpower Data Center, and survey data from the American and Puerto Rico community surveys. We also work closely with state demographers through our partnership group, the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates. At the sub-county geography level, the population estimates for cities and towns are created by distributing the county population estimates to each place within the county, and this is based on the place's number of occupied housing units and the average persons per household. We add that to an estimate of the population in group quarters. And finally, our estimates of housing units are also produced with a component-based method that starts with the most recent decennial census and uses a variety of survey and administrative data to estimate change in the housing stock, specifically in terms of building permits, estimates of non-permitted construction, mobile home shipments, and estimates of housing. Data sources include the Building Permit Survey, Survey of Construction, Manufactured Home Survey, American Community Survey, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency Individual Records on Requests for Disaster Assistance. Next slide. We've been invited here today to share our plans for overcoming issues with using the 2020 census as the base for our population estimates. However, at this point in time, with the 2020 census data still in review, we don't yet have a clear sense of exactly what types of challenges we may be facing. So in just a bit, we're going to describe our approach to identifying possible issues. But more immediately, the biggest obstacle facing us was the uncertainty surrounding the availability of finalized 2020 census files to serve as the base, which was the result of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our 2020 census operations. As the effects of the pandemic played out and adjustments to the schedule had to be made, it became apparent that the inputs for our base would likely not be available in time for when we'd need them for estimates production. And this was especially true given the fact that any estimates we create based on the 2020 census must adhere to enterprise disclosure avoidance policies. Specifically, we will need to infuse differentially private noise into the estimates for the first time, which involves a very significant amount of research. It was clear that we needed a solution that did not fully rely on the 2020 census for our July 1st, 2021 estimate series, which we refer to as Vintage 2021. The solution we came up with is to create what we're calling a blended base. This method begins with the April 1st, 2020 value from our Vintage 2020 estimate series, which is based on the 2010 census. It then controls this April 1, 2020 value to the results of the 2020 census that will already be available and potentially other data sources, such as the 2020 demographic analysis estimates, to create a plausible base. Presently, research is underway using data from 2010 to determine the logic of this approach, and particularly the specific data sources that will control to and how to overcome challenges such as creating plausible distributions of population for sub-county geographies. And I will now turn things over to Eric.
As Christine mentioned, we'll need to assess the 2020 census data to determine what issues might exist for using these data as the base for our estimates. To do this, we plan to leverage coverage measures produced by the Census Bureau, as well as our own estimates evaluation program. Next slide, please. One coverage measure we plan to use is demographic analysis, or DEA, which is a longstanding program that the Census Bureau uses to evaluate the quality of the census. DEA is also a product of the Population Estimates Program. Demographic analysis was first used by the Census Bureau in 1960 and has been used every decade since. This method generates national estimates of the population on Census Day by demographic detail. The estimates are produced using current and historical vital records, data on international migration, and Medicare records. So the primary difference between these estimates and our vintage population estimates is that we don't use census data for demographic analysis. The DA estimates are entirely independent of the census being evaluated, which is why they are an appropriate coverage measure. Next slide. The DA estimates are compared to the census counts to calculate the percent difference, which is known as net coverage error. Net coverage error combines both undercounts and overcounts for the same group. This means that if a group had a large undercount and an equally large overcount, we would show that as a net coverage error of 0. However, Groups that are consistently undercounted in the census usually do not have large overcounts, and vice versa. So for example, the college-age population is a group for which we see both undercounts and overcounts, but their net coverage error is positive, meaning overall they are overcounted. Demographic analysis is useful for showing patterns about coverage across demographic groups. We can look at these within a census or across different censuses. DEA has historically been used to highlight coverage differentials by race, and also, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, the undercount for young children aged 0 to 4. We'll be sharing our findings about coverage patterns in the 2020 census after their census results become available and we're able to calculate net coverage error. And that will be most likely later this year or in 2022. Next slide, please. This graph shows the DA % net coverage error from 1960 to 2010. We see that in 1960, all groups had an undercount, but the undercount for adult Black males was much larger than the other groups. Over time, coverage for all groups improved in the decennial census. As you can see with the net coverage error getting closer to 0. In fact, for the total population and for the non-Black population, this undercount even switches to an overcount in 2010. But even then, there's still the large differential between adult Black males and other groups. So this is just an example of what we can learn by using demographic analysis about the quality of the census. Next slide, please. On December 15th, we released the official 2020 demographic analysis estimates, which were produced at the national level. This includes one set of estimates by age, sex, and the DA race categories Black alone and non-Black alone. We also released a set of estimates by age, sex, and the DA race categories Black alone or in combination and non-Black alone or in combination. These estimates try to reflect that people can self-identify as more than one race. The third set of official estimates we released is by age, sex, and Hispanic origin. These estimates were only produced for the population age 0 to 29 on April 1st, or Census Day, because of when the Hispanic origin information became available in the birth records, which are used to produce the estimates. For each set of estimates, we released a range, so a low series, middle series, and high series. And we produced the range to reflect uncertainty in the data and methods used to produce the 2020 DA estimates. Finally, we released the components of population change used to produce all series and all sets. The components include births, deaths, international migration, and Medicare-based estimates. Next slide, please. Our low DA estimate for the total resident population was 330.7 million. The middle estimate was 332.6 million, and the high estimate was 335.5 million. In a few weeks, we'll be able to see how these estimates compare to the 2020 census totals, and we're very excited to make that comparison. Next slide, please. So as I stated, demographic analysis is an official coverage measure for the census. But then we have our estimates evaluation, which is kind of the flip side. The population estimates program relies on the census to evaluate the quality of the estimates through a project we refer to as estimates evaluation, or E2. So E2 is how we measure error in the estimates, and we use that to inform methodological improvements and research for this coming decade. Differences between the vintage 2020 population estimates and the 2020 census may result from several sources. So first, it could be error in the previous census, in which case the 2010 census, which would be carried forward into our estimates because we use the census as our base. Next, there's error in the components of demographic change. So this would be error resulting from the estimates methodology used to produce the vintage 2020 estimates. And then finally, error in the new census. In E2, differences are typically regarded as representing error in our estimates, not in the census. But due to the unusual circumstances surrounding the 2020 census, we recognize the increased potential for this kind of error in the new census. And so it's really going to be a challenge for us to parse that out. We expect these analyses will be conducted in 2021 and 2022. The specific timeline is contingent on the internal availability of the 2020 census data files. Next slide. E2 investigates differences at varying levels of geographic and demographic detail and include measures such as numeric and percent differences, as well as other measures you see on the slide. We have geospatial measures. We look at ways of understanding patterns among different geographic typologies. We conduct visual analyses of age structures. We look at time series charts and other types of analyses to identify outliers. At present, we have a team working to define the scope for our 2020 estimates evaluation analyses by examining what we've done over past decades and what our present needs are based on recent and pending methodological improvements that we are making, as well as consulting our partners in the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates, or FSCPE. In terms of trying to determine whether differences we observed could potentially represent an issue with the 2020 census data, one option we have is to examine how the differences we identify compare to differences identified in past decades. Because of method changes across decades, this may not be a clean comparison, but it could still be informative. Next slide. This table shows selected measures of accuracy by level of geography for the 2000 and 2010 censuses. So this is comparing to our population estimates. So we show the error closure and also the mean absolute percent error, or MATE, for the nation, state, counties, and cities and towns. Overall, we see that the population estimates become less accurate as compared to the census as we move to smaller levels of geography. We see this pattern in both Census 2000 and in the 2010 census. Also, within each level of geography below the national level, we see variation by population size. Next slide. This graph shows the mean absolute percent error by population size for incorporated places and minor civil divisions, which are also referred to as cities and towns. At these lower levels of geography, we see greater differences between the 2010 census counts and our vintage 2010 population estimates, and we would expect that. Each pair of red and blue bins represents a different population threshold, with the greatest differences by far observed for incorporated places and MCDs with a population below 5,000. You see the dashed lines at the top, those are the averages for all MCDs and all incorporated places. So we really see that these smaller places and smaller population sizes are really what's driving the big errors for incorporated places and MCDs. Next slide. So far I've only talked about our evaluations that compare population totals, but we're also able to look at characteristics. So we can disaggregate this type of analysis by age, by sex, by race. This graph shows the numeric and percent difference between the vintage 2010 and the 2010 census by age. Next slide. We see the largest differences for young children, which makes sense, and that's come up several times already today, but this undercount that's persistent in the census for young children. The red arrow highlights young children aged 0 to 4, where the population estimates were higher than the 2010 census. And we know from demographic analysis that these cohorts have a large net undercount. The blue arrow highlights children aged 10 to 14, where the census is higher than the population estimates. So the vintage 2010 estimates used the 2000 census as the population base. Young children were also undercounted in 2000. The population estimates aged those cohorts forward, but did not account for the coverage issues. So this graph is a really good example of how coverage errors in the census base get reproduced in the population estimates. Again, our estimates evaluation will focus on demographic characteristics for the nation, states, and counties. Next slide. Evaluations of coverage measures and the results from the E2 will help us determine a couple of important things. First, is the 2020 census fit for use as the estimates base? And second, are there specific geographies or characteristics that are concerning and we may have to make some adjustment for? So while we plan to use the 2020 census as the base for the population estimates as soon as possible, the findings from our E2 analysis may determine if we need to extend using this blended base for vintage 2022. So continuing with the blended base for an additional year is also a good option if more time is needed for research into the differences between census and our estimates, or if we need to develop and implement mitigation strategies. One of the benefits of blended base is that it's very adaptive. so it could be improved upon for use in vintage 2022. And these improvements could be informed by the results of our estimates evaluation. Another option is we could switch over to using unprotected 2020 census data for our base and then implement a differential privacy mechanism in our population estimates process. And now I'll turn the time back over to Christine.
Thanks, Eric. Next slide, please. In addition to identifying possible data-driven methodological changes, another mechanism for improving the estimates is our Population Estimates Challenge Program, which provides general-purpose governmental units with the opportunity to challenge their official estimates by submitting additional data to the Census Bureau for evaluation. This program has evolved over time, in part thanks to input from CSAC, but I'm going to describe the challenge program in its latest iteration. Estimates may be challenged in cases where there appears to have been a technical error in processing the input data or producing the estimates, or where incorrect input data were used to generate the estimates. In its current form, the program excludes challenges to official counts of housing units or group quarters populations or geographic boundary changes. Other programs of the Census Bureau, such as the Count Question Resolution Program or the Boundary and Annexation Survey, may be equipped to address some of the issues that are beyond our scope. And at present, the challenge program is actually suspended, which is a usual practice around the decennial year, and it's tentatively scheduled to resume next year for our vintage 2021 estimates. Next slide. Requested challenge estimates must be received within 90 days of their release by the Census Bureau, and they must include a letter from the Chief Executive Officer or the highest elected official, in addition to supporting evidence, and I'll describe shortly what qualifies as evidence. The key to a successful estimate challenge is to ensure that any data submitted are consistent with the criteria, standards, regular processes, and methodology that we employ to generate the estimate. And all of this is spelled out in the Challenge Program Review Guide that's made available on our website. The burden of proof is on the challenging entity, and the guide outlines a lot of information on how to provide that proof. Typically, the process begins with the government entity reaching out with an inquiry about their estimate or to share concerns. Once the challenge has been received, the POP Estimates program provides a derivation sheet containing the components that were used to create the estimate. Then the governmental unit provides back actual data and evidence materials for review and evaluation by POP Estimate staff. Next slide. As you heard earlier in the presentation, our county level estimates are based on a cohort component method. So for challenges to county estimates, a governmental unit may provide data on births, deaths, group quarters population, and domestic or net international migration. So these are the same components featured on the derivation sheet provided by the Census Bureau. Next slide. Meanwhile, our sub-county population estimates are based on the distributed housing unit method that I described. So for challenges to sub-county estimates, data related to changes in an area's housing stock may be submitted, including the information you see here on this list, like residential building permits, housing conversions, demolitions, mobile home placements, person per household, and facility level group quarters population data. And again, these are the components that would be featured on the derivation sheet that we provide. Next slide, please. Upon receipt, POP Estimate staff thoroughly review the challenge packages, and major considerations include, are the submitted data actually different from those that were used to generate the estimates? Is the documentation complete? Are the calculations correct? Are the time periods referenced aligned with our time periods? And for housing data, is the locality adequately covered by a survey? So in some instances where we rely on survey data for a housing component and an area is not covered by the survey, it opens them up to being able to submit alternative data types. So the challenge team makes recommendations for each challenged estimate to the Estimates and Projections Area Change Control Board, and then an official determination is made. Accepted challenges can then be viewed on our website. Next slide. So for example, this is the list of all the accepted challenges that we had for vintage 2018. Next slide, please.
Excuse me?
So as you can, okay. So as you can see, at this point in time, we're still faced with many unknowns, but we're already thinking ahead to where flexibilities might exist to mitigate issues that we may identify with using the 2020 census as the estimates base. For example, are there revisions that may be made to the challenge program? Naturally, there are many things that would need to be considered here. It already seems like the program will need to be updated when our estimates become differentially private. So what does that look like? Is it possible to expand the scope of the program in some way? Should the suspension of the program remain in place until we transition to using 2020 census data for the base? Second, we benefit from a wonderful partnership through the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates, which I mentioned earlier, and members of this group are designated by their state governors, and they represent the 50 states, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. Throughout the decade, they not only contribute to our input data for vital statistics and group quarters estimates, they also have the opportunity to review pre-release data and provide feedback on our methodology. So the big question that we have is there more that they can do? And to answer it, we'll be working with the FSCPE to evaluate innovative ways to maximize our partnership and data sharing. And finally, we're taking advantage of other opportunities for stakeholder engagement, like today's presentation, where we have the chance to hear feedback, such as ideas for other things that we should pursue or concerns regarding our current plans. Next slide. And that brings us to your questions.
That is fantastic. This is one of my absolute favorite topics. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
I'll turn it over to Rochelle.
Hello, this is Rochelle Winkler. Thanks so much to Christine and to Eric for that really clear presentation. And I also want to recognize them and the rest of the Population Estimates Program staff, too, for their really planful and proactive work to make the estimates as good as they can possibly be. You can go ahead and advance the slide, please. I want to start by just recognizing how important this program is and that the estimates are used for funding distribution. Billions of federal dollars are distributed based on these estimates. It's also used by for local and regional planning really extensively, and they serve as the base for the American Community Survey estimates. And so these are really important. There's always some tension at the beginning of the decade when the estimates that were produced over the decade are compared to the new census, and we saw some of that in the presentation comparing what happened with Census 2010. And the census is always considered as that gold standard that we're comparing against in the past. And I think we see a little bit of a different look at this or thinking about that with Census 2020. We're in that situation now where we're kind of starting to think about how we're going to compare the estimates to the census data. And with the delays and other challenges due to COVID-19, as well as changes in the disclosure avoidance system to using differential privacy, there's really a lot of uncertainty about how these things will impact the fitness for use for the Population Estimates Program. And so I think a lot of what we've heard from the program is essentially contingency planning or thinking through adaptations, opportunities, challenges, mitigation strategies, so that the program can produce the best estimates possible and be adaptive. And I think that's really good that they're looking forward that way. You can advance the slide, please. So regarding the methods, the cohort component method that's used to make the estimates at the county level, I think should benefit from general improvements in administrative records, over the last several years, particularly in births and deaths. But looking forward with migration, I wonder if there are some challenges. Migration is the harder component of population change to measure with administrative data. And the IRS data has been a core component for estimating migration. There have been some inconsistencies in the IRS migration data since 2015 that I've noticed in my own research. And that other people have pointed to as well. And I also wonder about COVID-related extensions to tax filing that likely have also impacted these data for the coming estimates here in the next year or two. And so I'm wondering what challenges this might bring. And then, given that housing unit data will be held invariant in the differentially private application process, I wonder if the PEP program has considered or tested relying more on the housing unit method, even at the county level, as a supplement to, or even in some cases instead, maybe, of cohort component methods that use census data as a base. And I'm not sure how much that has come into some of the thinking about the blended base or how that might work, but it seems like it might be a possibility. You could advance the slide, please. And then regarding the blended estimates base, this is necessary for vintage 2021, given that the delayed release of Census 2020. And as we heard, it's something that the program is considering for later years as well, depending on the results of the E2 evaluation. And this strikes me as a potential big change from past practice. And so I think it would be really interesting to hear more about the kinds of data sources that might be incorporated and the kind of models that might be used, particularly if this estimates base ends up getting used further into the future. Advance the slide, please. And as Christine and Eric noted, when we're thinking about that E2, it's really hard to know where the error comes from, whether it's going back to Census 2010, the components have changed, or if it's something about Census 2020. And we can look to demographic analysis for insight, and that's nice, as they pointed out, because it's not connected to the census itself. But it's still hard to know where the error comes from because there can be some error in the demographic analysis data, and then also because that demographic analysis is at the nationwide scale, and so much of the work in this program goes down to really local level geographies. And so when we look at these measures of difference between the census and the estimates, like the MAPE, for instance, I think these are good indicators of average errors. But I also want to emphasize the importance of considering the distribution of error and those units from which we see more extreme differences. And I was glad to hear Christine and Eric mention that as well. In 2010, from what they showed, we saw that it was really these very small population units, whether they're counties or municipalities, with higher MAPEs. And I wonder how that might be different in 2020, especially when we think about age breakdowns, for instance, at the county level, and the differentially private data. And some of the looks that I know we haven't seen demonstration data from differential privacy that included age breakdowns for some time now. We're still waiting to have that addressed after the PL data. But in the last set of demonstration data that were released, the age breakdowns indicated that there would be some real challenges in terms of fitness for use with those differentially private data. And I expect that's what the program is reacting to in making some of these considerations. And ultimately, I think it is important for the Bureau to consider what it says to all kinds of data users. If Census 2020 data are deemed not fit for use or requiring some kind of adjustment for the population estimates program, what does that communicate to other users? Can advance the slide, please? And so the differential privacy, as noted, brings new challenges to PEP. And so broadly, you know, I think we started to hear a little bit about how PEP is adjusting to differential privacy and working on these issues, and what are some of the challenges and how are they being addressed. I think there's probably quite a bit more work that's going into that. And any data that's released will be subject to differential privacy. I've been unclear on whether the PEP program internally will have access to invariant data. It sounded like from the presentation today that they will, and I think that would be super important in order to be able to evaluate the E2 so that you can know how much of that error in E2 is driven by differential privacy and how much of it comes from other sources. But I would love to hear some clarification on whether, at least internally, PEP will have access to the invariant data. But then I think it's important to think about what tests PEP is doing to explore that potential impact of differential privacy, and what are you finding there as well. And then, as Christine raised, and you could advance the slide here, there is some important considerations in terms of how DP will impact the challenge program. So, for instance, I'm not sure what PEP will be able to provide on the derivation sheet under a differentially private DAS. So if somebody challenges, for instance, you wouldn't necessarily be able to provide numbers that they can use to compare with their own numbers. And so I'm curious about how that might play out, and probably that's something that the program is working on identifying. And then would it be possible for units to challenge the base? And is that a scope change that PEP is considering? Another question would be whether it's possible to challenge at the county level using a housing unit estimate in some cases. We've seen that to be important in the context of natural disasters, for instance, but also perhaps moving forward, given that housing units are invariant, maybe that could be a way to look at what that means. And then finally, just noting that with that 90-day limit to when entities have to challenge from when the data are released, as soon as the program can publish a Federal Register notice with that guide of how the challenge program will work moving forward, it would be great to see it sooner rather than later so that units can prepare for that. Thank you very much.
Awesome. You know, Rochelle raised a number of good questions, and I know you guys are still really formulating, but if there's some thoughts that you can share in response to her questions, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a lot. I don't even know where to jump in. I mean, regarding our differential privacy work, challenges that we're kind of coming into, you know, at present, our primary focus really has been on developing the blended base for vintage 2021, since that's more pressing schedule-wise. But before we shifted gears to that, we did have the opportunity for our staff to assess the parts of our production process that rely on the census data and start to explore the impact of using noisy, unprotected data for those processes versus using unprotected data and then, you know, creating our own mechanisms to introduce noise. So there are numerous challenges associated with each possible approach. So at this point, we're in part taking our cue from CEDA and the direction that the Bureau is headed with its disclosure avoidance system. You know, I know that they're trying to get us a microdata detail file that's of sufficient quality that we could use it as our base. And if that goal isn't met, then we'll pursue using, you know, unprotected data and collaborating with CEDA and how we could implement our own differential privacy mechanism into our estimates production. But we do expect to have internal access to invariant data for our testing, to the unprotected data. And so, you know, we're going to factor that in when we kind of work out our specific tests once we get past the blended base work.
I see Deborah Balk has a question. Deborah, do you want to go ahead?
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Allison. Thanks to everybody. The good discussion, good comments from the Bureau. Much appreciated. And this is Deborah Balk for the record. I was wondering if you have any comment on estimates for by race and ethnicity in particular, because of the new rollout of these new classes in the 2020 census and what you're seeing in that. I know that a lot of people were reporting, at least in the ethnicity choices, that like they felt the ethnicity choice, the Latinx, Hispanic ethnicity choice fulfilled the requirement on the race category, and therefore that there are some looking at changes over time. It will be difficult to, look at population estimates by racial and ethnic subgroups effectively, or at least with a lot of complexity. So I'm wondering what your early analysis of that might, whether you could speak to that as well, just like you did with age. Oh, and while I'm at, before I end, the age distribution, the age graph that you showed is really interesting as well, and I also wonder about the implication of that since there's differential fertility by racial and ethnic groups as well. So if that also has an impact, that trickles down when we're counting in particular places, when we get to smaller geographies that are disproportionately Hispanic or Black and so forth. Thanks very much.
So right now the census edited file is still in review, and my area actually, until the data have been kind of approved by the other areas in the population division, we don't really have access to it. So we haven't seen any of the early results for the different race and ethnicity groups you've described, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we're kind of looking ahead to, with anticipation when we do our estimates evaluation program that Eric was describing.
Yeah, and just to second that, once we do start evaluating our most current vintage of estimates, we'll definitely look at race and how our prior estimates of, by race and ethnicity compare with the census counts, and that's really important for what we do moving forward in this coming decade as far as our methodologies for estimating by race and ethnicity.
Well, this is Deborah again. I really look forward to seeing a report on that as it unfolds. Thanks very much.
Great. This is Allison. I don't see other questions, but I did want to follow up on something that Michelle asked about, and in terms of the challenge programs, I think everybody knows that, well, first of all, let me just say I think it's fantastic that you're looking at, how to use the various sources of data and analyses that you have to adjust the blended base, and that is, it's great. I think we need to think about innovating, given some of the challenges of the last year. And similarly, could we be thinking about innovating around the challenge program, right? Obviously, between 2000 and 2010, counties were allowed to challenge based on housing unit, and there was a large stream of research that indicated that, the housing unit method didn't always produce a more accurate estimate than the census, but it did in some places and not in others. And, obviously in the case of New Orleans, I think you all remember that we challenged, and our way of estimating that you accepted brought the estimate ultimately, comparing to 2010, about 6% higher than it would have been. So that was off, but if we hadn't challenged, it would have been about 22% lower because of the difficulty of estimating the repopulation of the city after Katrina, of course. So we think that challenge was worthwhile, and we hope you do too. And so with all of the dynamics of the various disasters in the pandemic, is there thought that perhaps, relooking at challenge programs and how that might be done in this decade would be worthwhile?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that the methodological changes that we're exploring for the blended base and especially for differential privacy are going to have an impact on the challenge program. It's just like at this point, as you've kind of suspected, exactly what it looks like is going to depend on the method that we end up with. So, exactly what the details are with the logic for our blended base, and then more specifically, like what type of differential privacy mechanism do we end up using, whether we are building off the protected MDF or developing estimates from unprotected data and then adding noise later. Whichever direction we go in is going to affect what data we're able to provide to challenging units, and then also what the requirements will be for the alternative data that they provide back to us. So we recognize that there's probably going to have to be pretty comprehensive changes, but it's too early. We don't have enough information to know what that's going to turn into. And we will absolutely, be planning on a Federal Register notice, and either it's going to be, one that announces that we're resuming the program, or it's going to be one that kind of spells out the methodology of the new program and seeks feedback. But we're going to be moving ahead with that as soon as we possibly can. But there's still a lot of other things that we have to figure out first.
Absolutely. Totally understand. Great. Well, I think we should probably move along to the next topic.
Hey, Allison, I have a question. This is Mario.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go for it, Mario. Sorry, I didn't see you. Please.
So, no, I mean, this is just, as I'm listening, it seems like the population estimates program doesn't have access to the early census results, and it's going to have to figure out a whole bunch of things very quickly to get back onto their timeline. Is there any chance that perhaps some of this early census results can be, can start to be worked on by the population estimates program to see, what they're going to need to do? So many moving pieces, so many things that are going to change for them, and they sound completely blind, like we're just going to go into it, get the data, and then figure out how we're going to do it. That doesn't sound like the best plan. So.
Yeah, no, we feel you. I think that what we see is the blended base is kind of what's buying us time, because there is a lot of work that we can do using data from 2010 to test out different population controls, like, using demographic analysis to see if that improves the distribution of children at young ages. But we can kind of work things out with 2010 data, and then when we have access to 2020, we can apply that and see if the model that we've worked out, is supported. And that's a lot more straightforward than the differential privacy work. But if we're doing that for vintage 2021, and we expect, to have the census data over the coming months, I think that we'll be in a good position for vintage 2021 production, and then that gives us the extra time to prepare for vintage 2022 and potentially switching over to using some kind of differential privacy mechanism then. But something I think that we mentioned in the presentation is that the blended base, I think Eric said it's adaptive, and we can kind of continue on with it. So as much time as we need to research to make sure that we're making the best estimates we possibly can, we'll be able to extend our blended base to give ourselves that time.
Oh, and just as a quick follow-up again, Mario Marazzi, so the blended base, is that just going to be a temporary thing until the final census data is out, or are we going to carry that on through the whole decade?
I think the ideal is that we would switch over to using the 2020 census as the base. We don't, as we said before, like there's so many unknowns, we don't know when that would happen, and we want to be able to thoroughly research the file and evaluate it for our own use. So we do really see the blended base as being kind of a stopgap measure, but we just don't know how long we're going to be using it for, and we want to make sure that unto itself that it still creates really good estimates as well.
Got it. Well, I urge you guys to get the information as soon as possible so you guys can start figuring that out. So.
Thanks. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Mario. That was really important. Appreciate you chiming in. So I can turn it over to Tommy, I think, now for the next topic.
Thank you very much, Christine, Eric, and Rochelle, and everyone. And now we welcome Sally Keller and Dan Murin of the Jason Study Group, who will present for up to 20 minutes on the assessment of 2020 census data quality processes. And that will be followed by a committee discussion, call and committee discussion, totaling about up to 15 minutes. Sally and Dan?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. I couldn't tell if my audio was connected. So I'll start, and I'm having a few power issues at my house, so if I blink out, Dan will jump in. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So the first thing I just wanted to share, I think that the advisory committee is somewhat familiar with Jason since we've now worked with Census for a number of years, but I just wanted to sort of review who we are. We're an organization that was founded in 1959. We try to advise the government on scientific and technical matters related to national security. The important thing to note is that we operate autonomously, we're self-governed, and we have absolutely no obligation to please. So we really try to tell it like it is and what we find. Many of our members are members of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And as you know, we now have a really wonderful history of working with the Census Bureau and advising them. Next slide, please. So let me just put a little context behind this, and this is something that this audience is very familiar with, perhaps more familiar than some of the other audiences that we've briefed. And, first of all, you know that the census spends more than a decade planning the decennial. And this decennial, as in other decades, they definitely had plans for contingencies, but were simply hit with unprecedented disruptions around COVID and just a higher number of environmental storms and disasters that raised some concerns over possible erosion of the data quality from the census enumeration process and post-data processing. Next slide, please. So the question that Census put before the JSON was the following: what should the Census Bureau take action upon to strengthen production and release of metrics to inform on 2020 census data quality? And our focus was very much on the processes that the census had put in place and were executing. We did not actually do data analysis like the ASA task force will be doing or is doing. We really focused on the processes themselves. We started the study in the first week of January with an incredible set of briefings on census operations that were had taken place in the field, the post-data collection processing that was underway. And our focus was on the congressional apportionment and redistricting data products. We completed the report, or it was approved by Census February 8th. We actually delivered the first draft of the report to Census by the end of January, so this was a pretty quick and aggressive study that was pulled together. And I really want to thank the Census Bureau and the colleagues there for being responsive to our questions, for being available, for providing us with a large volume of other materials outside of the briefings that really helped our deliberations. Next slide, please. Well, as you know, every census is different, and it's neither desirable nor possible to repeat the prior process. The Census Bureau has a huge history of bringing innovation decade over decade to try to improve the process over the past decades. However, it is really important that the Census Bureau helps communicate to the public that there's an accepted range of results over previous decades, and this allows for considerable imperfections as long as there is not a knowingly a priori biases actually against individual states or statutorily defined classes of individuals. And that's really what lies at the crux of trying to understand the data quality processes and data quality issues. Next slide, please. This decennial experienced a range of externalities that led to multiple revisions of the timeline. And in fact, the last 3 replans on this chart happened during the course of our study. So things were moving fast, and Census was trying to, kind of pivot and move with the demands that were placed upon them, which, if you can go to the next slide, which actually causes, concern over the data quality and raises concerns over data quality. And what we think is really important for everyone to understand that field operations and post-data collection processing are deliberate activities that take time, and the time has to be there to do them properly. And so our first recommendation is simply that the Secretary of Commerce should order a return to a timeline that allows adequate time for complete, accurate, and transparent processing of the data. We think that's really important, and President Biden supported that with this executive order. Next slide, please. Now, measuring quality of the process, there are several things the Census Bureau is doing and other things that they could perhaps do that they had not initially planned for. And the question that the Census Bureau, repeated to us many times was the following: would some other well-informed group have made similar decisions? And I think we all can agree that this is a counterfactual that we cannot test. However, we can look at different ways to try to evaluate the quality of the process. Was it reasonable or fair? And we have proposed 3 different types of metrics that the Census Bureau should consider. One that looks at spatial and demographic differences, a second set of metrics that could provide direct comparison to various baselines, and a third type of metrics that may not be traditionally what Census has done, which would be to look at the operational shifts over time and the implications of those. And that's because so much was changing, as you saw in those previous timelines. So many decisions were happening in real time and were changing that you might want to look at the implications that those had over the course of the enumeration processes. Next slide, please. So for the first type of metrics, the intercomparison of quality metrics, we think first of all, we acknowledge that the Census Bureau already is proposing a whole collection of metrics in this category, and they should do those. They're good. But we think that perhaps they could do a few more things. And that by making a distinction between process measures, things that quantify steps taken during the data collection process, such as how many enumerators per area, the average number of non-response follow-up visits, those types of measures, and contrasting those with outcome measures that are measures around the data that's being collected itself, such as the percent of completed enumerations or the percent of self-response, percent of enumerations by proxy. By thinking of those 2 categories of measures will allow for actually correlating process with outcome, and that could be a valuable way to be looking for any spatial or other types of biases that have, crept into the process. Next slide, please. It's important to remember that any public release of information around data quality will require a review for disclosure avoidance and disclosure analysis. And it may be necessary to add privacy noise to some of the releases that would count against the privacy loss budget. So along with our recommendation to be looking at different types of differential counts of the population, potential differential counts of the population across various geographies or demographic groups, that the Census Bureau should also pay close attention to how these results would be released, trying to keep them to limited summary statistics that would not require consumption of the privacy loss budget. We feel strongly that the expenditure of the privacy loss budget should be prioritized to optimize the accuracy of the future census data products that will be released. Next slide, please. Now, the second type of metrics, the intercomparison of data quality metrics. Here again, the Census Bureau always does comparisons against various independent control sets, various baselines, such as previous censuses, demographic analyses, and ultimately the post-enumeration survey. But we noted that there was another potential source of data that the Census Bureau could do some direct comparisons against, and that was the 2019 census test response. And for the 2019 census test, and the response rates in particular, that gives you sort of a pre-COVID what were the response patterns like, and then post-COVID, what were the response patterns. And it might be useful to compare those to try to understand implications that COVID had on the quality of the response rates. Next slide, please. The Census Bureau has, some incredible innovations for this decennial for 2020. Jason had the nice opportunity to actually review some of these several years ago, the Internet response mode in particular. So the Census Bureau, as you know, had planned for increased use of administrative records, Internet response mode, and massive reengineering of field operations to help manage rapid assessment of activities in the field and redistribution of resources. And it turns out that these innovations that they planned, they didn't necessarily plan it to respond to COVID-19, but they probably put the Census Bureau in a really good position to be able to respond quickly to the environmental conditions and the disruptions that COVID-19 placed on the enumeration processes. Next slide, please. So first of all, there are all sorts of information technology infrastructure that the census built for this decennial, which is really great because it allows for the collection of data that could be analyzed across these different control system tools to look at the enumeration process as it unfolded, compare it to previous decennials, and also to use this data as a depiction of indicators that highlight response by Census Bureau to the pandemic and other events. This could be actually incorporated into some of the communication that the Census Bureau can be rolling out to relevant stakeholders. So it's just really great that these systems are there and that data could be pulled and used in this way. Next slide, please. An example of a wonderful tool that the Census Bureau created, we were very impressed with this new tool, the CRAVA tool. And this particular tool was created to help support the core of internal subject matter experts within Census that were gearing up to do the end-to-end review of the data so that they could do this quickly, that they'd have a lot of information available to be doing comparison against. Well, this also provides another opportunity for the Census Bureau to make use of the reports generated by the CRAVA tool to show how the data quality issues were identified and addressed over the time as the various Census Bureau products are being produced. These issues and their resolution could be summarized graphically using a set of time-dependent quality metrics obtained from retrospective analysis of the enumeration data and the processes. So it's a really great tool, and I think that some of our early briefings may have been the first public preview of this tool. Next slide, please. This brings me now to the issue of issues that the Census Bureau expected to find that have been labeled anomalies. And these are things, again, I think as this audience knows, are inconsistencies that are not surprising. Any massive data collection process, when you go through the data quality control processes associated with that, are going to find different types of issues that you expect and that you expect to be able to correct. Unfortunately, terming these anomalies, which is the technical term that we use for these, may cause inappropriate alarm to non-experts, and that we recommend that as the Census Bureau communicates on the issues that they find, that they think about how to communicate that in a way that it doesn't inadvertently raise concern over the things that they have found. And also, keeping track of anomalies is a wonderful quality measure, in particular as you compare this to what was found in 2010 and in other types of data collection. Next slide, please. Another one of the innovations was the increased use of administrative records, and that also was impacted. You know, the great example was the change of tax day that then led to sort of an asynchronous alignment of the use of the administrative data records as the census had planned to use them. Again, the Census Bureau did a pivot on this and made some changes in how they use the administrative records. Our main recommendation here is that was great, and that we encourage the Census Bureau to continue to look and do research and explore the use of administrative records and third-party records as we move towards 2030. Next slide, please. And this brings me to our last topic, and that's the topic of communication. Again, during the course of this study, we were impressed and surprised about all of the things that were going on during the enumeration process. And a lot of these activities just aren't or haven't yet been communicated out. We know the Census Bureau has quite a laudable communication machinery that gets out there to talk about the importance of being counted, the value of all the products and the research that the Census Bureau does and that others do with census data. However, we feel the Census Bureau has fallen short in their communications around the enumeration processes and changes made to these processes, including those resulting in improvements. So the recommendation is that the Census Bureau develop a tiered messaging that starts with some shorter messages into longer presentations, allowing more level of detail about the quantification of the myriad of efforts that were undertaken to try to ensure an accurate count in the 2020 census. And let me conclude with the next slide to just recap that, again, the 2020 census faced just unprecedented challenges. The innovations that had been planned in for the decennial allowed for the census to pivot quickly and respond to unplanned scheduling. The Census Bureau's internal systems are powerful for capturing information that could be leveraged to enhance quality assessment. And finally, the Census Bureau has the capability for excellent communications, and these could be turned and engaged to try to communicate around the high quality of the enumeration processes. And with that, that's all I've got to say.
That's great. Thank you. Let me turn it over to Kunal Talwar.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, I guess I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about discussing this last presentation and adding a few more things. So I guess next slide, please. So let me start by repeating what has been said before today. So the 2020 census introduced new innovations and faced unprecedented challenges. So kudos to the leadership, the planning, dedication, and hard work of the Census Bureau staff for ensuring that we are going to have an accurate census despite these challenges. I think, as we heard, the JSON group also returned this report in a very, very short time. So many thanks to them. I think I agree with all of what was in the JSON report, but just wanted to add a bit on certain aspects of what was said. So I guess in terms of what we expect from the census, I guess the report said that we should plan for the decennials so that it produces results that improve on the standards set in the previous decades, and this is certainly an important requirement. I believe it can be clarified further in terms of whether we plan for this to happen in the average case or even in the presence of rare events such as 2020. I think, as the CSAC has recommended in the past, the Bureau should take the time needed to ensure acceptable quality standards, and I'm glad we are at least seem to be on track to do that. I think to avoid the tension between timeliness and the quality, even in the presence of adverse events such as 2020, it may be worth discussing if more buffer time can be added to the schedule to reduce this tension, and so this may not be entirely in the Bureau's hands. More broadly, it might be useful for the Bureau to kind of formalize and codify the processes it uses as important steps to ensure quality that it deems necessary. Next slide, please. That being said, I think accuracy alone is not enough, and we need to ensure that, as the report said, that there are no systemic biases in our counting. A lot of advances in the census have come from better methods like administrative records, focus on online, and these can sometimes lead to undercounts in certain populations. For example, it's easier for the internet savvy or the younger population to use the online tools. So I guess what that does is it makes the aggregate undercounts not necessarily not as useful a guide as one would hope. So while we should do the best to reduce undercount across all groups, we should set our standards for undercount for various groups. We don't want to keep the undercount the same as 2020 by reducing undercount for some groups and increasing undercount for other groups, for example. So I think it would be valuable if all the quality checks ensure that the quality is within the range of accepted values, not just in aggregate, but within each subgroup that may be affected. Similarly, for the post-enumeration survey, it would be very valuable if we can report on the accuracy sliced by various subgroups. And I guess given the broad uses of the census data, just the statutorily defined classes may not be enough, and we may want to think about what other axes we may want to slice along. Next slide, please. So I guess that's mostly what I wanted to say. I put on this slide just my one-line summaries of all the recommendations from the JSON report for the rest of the committee to look at and discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunal. I think that's great. And I think I love this slide where you've got anomalies scratched out and issues, expected issues that we address when we are gathering data, and we have to clean it up. And that's just how it is. So appreciate your making that visual clarity. Do we have anything the JSON folks would like to say in response to what Kunal articulated?
I don't think so, Dan. Anything?
No, I guess it would be interesting to know, if there's some detail about how to better slice up the various groups. We hadn't really thought about that, and I think that could be useful. Any amount of information I think that reflects on the quality would be useful. So if there's particular details involved about those special groups that might have been impacted, that would be good to know.
Great. Okay. CSAC members? Oh, I see Kristen has her hand up. Go ahead, Kristen. Kristen, we don't hear you, so you might be on mute.
Kristen Moore, this is Sean LeBeg.
Oh, no. Kristen, we can't hear you.
Maybe she can put the question in chat.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Kristen, if you can access the chat.
I don't think it's accessible.
Oh, she took her hand down. So maybe she didn't want to jump in just then. Great. Well, I don't see other hands up. So I think we can go on, but I know the next thing is a break. And before we break, Tommy, would it be okay if I gave some instructions to the CSAC members about what we'll do when we reconvene?
Yes, let me say a little bit, though. May I?
Please, go ahead. Yeah, please.
I want to thank Sally and Dan for the speedy report and for being here today to share it with us. And I want to thank Kunal for the discussion, serving as discussant. And so I'm now, Allison, go ahead.
Oh, great. Well, CSAC members, we're going to have a break, and we've even regained a little time. So thanks so much to all of you and to all of the presenters today. I'm really pleased that we've got through all this. It's a good amount of information, but I know a lot of folks spent a lot of time thinking about it ahead of time. So thanks to everyone for the preparation. So why don't we break until we were.
I think, Allison, I do have to say something, though.
Okay, go ahead.
That this concludes the CSAC fall virtual meeting proceedings for day one. That is, it will conclude, and the committee will continue with its offline discussions, but this will conclude what the public is hearing.
Yeah, that's true. And then I'll just give some instructions to the CSAC members before we hang up.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. We'll see everyone at 11 tomorrow morning.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Conference. So, yeah, hopefully WebEx won't cut us off, or Verizon.
Allison?
Yes.
Yes. Allison, you're still in the public meeting. You'll be going to your host room if you'll hold just a moment.
Thank you very much, Shauna.
Yeah.
And now, thank you very much, everyone.
Madison, go ahead.